Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime. Before we begin tonight's case, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? It's always fascinating to see how these quiet late-night stories reach people all over the world. And if you enjoy these calm, atmospheric dives into true crime, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tonight, we enter the chilling world of Richard Kaplinski, a man who lived two very different lives. To his neighbors in suburban New Jersey, he was the perfect family man, a loving husband, a doting father, the kind of guy who hosted backyard barbecues and waved good morning on his way to work. But in the shadows, he was something else entirely. A professional killer. A man who claimed to have murdered over 200 people with methods so cold, so calculated, that the Mafia gave him a name that would haunt investigators for decades, the Iceman. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Richard Leonard Kaplinski was born on April 11, 1935 in Jersey City, New Jersey, a place that, at the time, was a tough working-class neighborhood full of crowded tenements, struggling families, and a constant sense of survival. Life was already harsh in the Kaplinski household, but Richard's childhood went far beyond ordinary hardship. It was defined by a darkness that shaped everything he would one day become. His father, Stanley Kaplinski, was a violent Polish immigrant who worked as a brakeman for the railroad. Stanley drank heavily, gambled, and had a temper that turned unpredictable and deadly. His mother, Anna McNally, an Irish Catholic, was equally strict, deeply religious, and emotionally cold. Together, they created an environment of fear and control, a breeding ground for anger and trauma that Richard carried for the rest of his life. Stanley's beatings were brutal. He would come home drunk and lash out at anyone nearby, most often his children. Richard, the second of four siblings, quickly learned that there was no safe place in his own home. His father's violence wasn't just emotional or verbal, it was physical, vicious, and unrelenting. In later interviews, Richard would describe nights when Stanley used his fists, belts, and anything else he could grab. Once, in a fit of rage, Stanley beat Richard's older brother Florian so badly that the boy died from his injuries. Richard was only 5 years old when he witnessed his brother's lifeless body being carried away. The family covered up the death, claiming Florian had fallen down the stairs, and Stanley faced no charges. That early brush with death, and the fact that violence had no consequences, planted a dangerous seed in Richard's young mind. Anna, his mother, offered no comfort. She was deeply religious and believed that discipline was necessary to raise good Catholic children. But for Anna, discipline came in the form of sharp wooden spoons, broom handles, and endless hours of fear. She prayed for her children, but she also hit them. Richard grew up believing that love was conditional, safety was temporary, and the world rewarded power and punishment. In his mind, weakness had no place in survival. The combination of his father's uncontrolled violence and his mother's cold detachment shaped Richard into a boy who rarely showed emotion and learned to internalize pain rather than express it. By the time Richard was in grade school, he had become quiet, withdrawn, and unpredictable. Teachers described him as an average student but noted that he had difficulty following rules and controlling his temper. Classmates mocked his shabby clothes and polished Irish background, and Richard learned early that humiliation burned deeper than pain. He responded the only way he knew how, through aggression. One day, after being bullied at school, he waited for his tormentor outside the building and beat the boy so severely that the teachers had to pull Richard off him. It was one of his earliest acts of uncontrolled violence, and instead of remorse, Richard felt something strange: relief. The streets of Jersey City became Richard's refuge. He spent more and more time outside, wandering alleys, and abandoned lots avoiding his father's wrath. It was during these long, lonely hours that Richard first encountered stray animals, cats, dogs, pigeons, and began experimenting with cruelty. It started small, throwing rocks, trapping birds, watching them struggle. But soon, it escalated into something darker. Richard later admitted to killing stray animals to see how it felt, calling it a twisted form of power he had never experienced before. The act of controlling life and death, even in its smallest form, gave him a sense of dominance he lacked at home. This was also the period when Richard started spending time with a group of local street kids. They were older, rougher, and already involved in petty crimes, stealing cars, shoplifting, hustling money. Among them, Richard found a strange kind of belonging. Unlike at home or school, here he wasn't mocked or controlled. But acceptance came with its own price. The group encouraged violent behavior, treating cruelty as a rite of passage. Richard soon gained a reputation as someone who didn't hesitate to fight, and he began using his size. Even as a teenager, he was tall and imposing, to intimidate others. While most kids avoided confrontations, Richard sought them out, testing boundaries and discovering how much control he could exert over those around him. One of the defining moments of his teenage years came when he killed for the first time, at least according to his own later confessions. The story is murky, but Richard claimed that at around the age of 14 or 15, he beat a neighborhood bully named Charlie Lane to death with a wooden clothes hanger pole after the older boy had humiliated him in front of his friends. Richard didn't stop hitting until Charlie stopped moving. Panicked, he dragged the body to the Hudson River and dumped it, expecting police to come knocking at his door. But nobody ever did. The disappearance was never solved, and Charlie's body was never recovered. In Richard's mind, this was the first time he realized a terrifying truth. If you were careful, if you didn't talk, you could get away with murder. This revelation became a turning point. From that moment forward, Richard's detachment from normal human empathy deepened. He began testing limits, often picking fights with anyone who crossed him. But more disturbingly, he developed a methodical patience when dealing with people who angered him. He would stop them, wait for the right moment, and exact his revenge in silence. Years later, when investigators asked him why he killed so easily, Richard responded flatly, "If someone bothers me, I get rid of them. That's it. It's better than arguing." That chilling simplicity, the absence of guilt, the absence of hesitation, became his defining trait. By his late teens, Richard was already feared in his neighborhood. He stood over 6 feet tall, with a broad frame and an intimidating presence. But behind his cold, silent demeanor was a young man who had built an entire philosophy around survival and dominance. His father's violence had taught him that the world respected strength. His mother's religion had taught him guilt, but not compassion. And his early killings had taught him that consequences were avoidable. This dangerous mix of beliefs hardened Richard into someone capable of extraordinary cruelty while appearing outwardly calm. Still, despite his growing reputation, Richard wanted more than the chaotic street life of Jersey City. He craved control, not just over people, but over his entire environment. He began to distance himself from the petty street gangs and started operating alone. He learned how to hide evidence, how to manipulate situations, and, most importantly, how to mask his emotions. By the time he turned 20, Richard had become almost invisible in the eyes of law enforcement. There were whispers on the streets about a tall, quiet kid who made people disappear, but without bodies or witnesses, there was nothing to connect him to anything. This was the foundation on which the Iceman would be built. Before the Mafia contracts, before the refrigerated bodies, before the infamous interviews from prison, there was a boy who grew up in a house of fear, who learned early that violence solved problems, and who discovered that. In a city full of shadows, silence was the most powerful weapon of all. But Richard's story was only beginning. The same violent instincts that carried him through his childhood would soon draw the attention of powerful men in New Jersey's criminal underworld. They saw his coldness, his ability to detach from morality, and his unwavering silence as assets. And when the Mafia came knocking, Richard Kaplinski would step fully into the darkness, transforming from an angry street kid into one of the most feared contract killers in American history. By the time Richard Kaplinski reached his late teens, the chaos of his childhood had already forged a cold and calculating temperament. He had learned to survive in an environment where cruelty was routine and violence was expected. But now he was moving into a different stage of life, one where his anger and need for control evolved into something darker, something deliberate. What began as impulsive outbursts during his youth slowly transformed into a chilling ritual of dominance, precision, and silence. The streets of Jersey City in the early 1950s were not a place of safety or redemption. Poverty, gang disputes, and organized crime shaped daily life. The city was a breeding ground for violence, and Richard quickly discovered that survival demanded ruthlessness. He carried himself differently from the other young men around him, not loud, not flashy, but intense and intimidating. His towering frame, sharp gaze, and quiet demeanor made people uneasy. While others relied on bluster and threats, Richard simply acted. It was during these years that he became obsessed with control. For Richard, humiliation was the ultimate trigger. He never forgot a slight, never forgave an insult. And unlike most, he didn't rely on fists alone. He planned. He waited. And then he struck. He once said in an interview decades later, "I don't like being talked down to. If someone embarrassed me, I made sure they didn't get the chance to do it again." That wasn't bravado. It was a philosophy. Richard learned to use fear as a weapon, slowly crafting the persona that would later make him so effective as a professional killer. The first confirmed disappearance tied to Richard was a local street bully named Charlie Lane, someone who had tormented Richard during his early teens. Richard never forgot the humiliation Charlie caused him in front of others. One day, after yet another confrontation, Richard followed Charlie into an alley and beat him mercilessly with a wooden pole. By the time Richard stopped, Charlie was motionless. Acting on instinct, Richard dragged the body to the Hudson River and dumped it. He waited for the police to come. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. No one ever asked questions. That absence of consequence became a defining moment in Richard's psychology, a moment when he realized that if you were careful, if you were quiet, you could commit unthinkable acts and simply walk away. After Charlie, Richard began testing himself. He picked targets deliberately, though always with justification in his own mind. If someone insulted him, threatened him, or crossed him in any way, he responded with lethal finality. By his early 20s, he claimed to have killed several men in street confrontations. But there were no bodies, no witnesses, and no evidence tying him to anything. His silence was his shield, and it was working. During this period, Richard spent long hours alone, refining his methods. He started learning about different ways to kill quickly and quietly, reading, observing, experimenting. Knives, blunt objects, and later firearms became tools, but his focus was always on precision. One shot, one strike, one decision. But what truly distinguished Richard was his ability to completely detach himself from what he was doing. He didn't see his victims as people, he saw them as problems. To Richard, removing them was no different than fixing a broken pipe or discarding trash. That cold, mechanical detachment would later earn him the nickname the Iceman, but even now, long before the Mafia contracts, The transformation had already begun. At the same time, Richard's personal life remained strangely ordinary on the surface. He began dating, held small jobs, and even spent time with friends. He was careful to separate his violent world from the image he presented to others. If anything, this duality fascinated him. He enjoyed the idea of being underestimated, the quiet, polite young man who blended into the background while hiding a violent capacity most couldn't imagine. In his early 20s, Richard crossed paths with a group of older, more experienced criminals who ran small-time rackets in Jersey City and Newark. They noticed his size, his composure, and his lack of hesitation when confronted with danger. One of them later recalled that Richard never flinched, he didn't scare easily, and he didn't talk unnecessarily. In that world, silence was currency, and Richard understood its value better than most. Through these connections, Richard began taking on small jobs, enforcing debts, scaring shopkeepers, and handling troublemakers who owed money to the wrong people. These were dangerous assignments, but Richard thrived. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, and didn't brag, making him seem trustworthy in a business where loose talk could get you killed. Slowly, he built a reputation as someone who could handle problems permanently. Around this time, Richard began frequenting bars in Newark and Hoboken where organized crime figures gathered. Here, he encountered men connected to the Gambino crime family, one of New York's most powerful mafia organizations. They were always looking for muscle, men who could handle violence discreetly and without hesitation. Richard fit perfectly into that mold. But before they would trust him, they wanted to test him. One of his earliest tasks came from an associate connected to the mob. A local man had been skimming profits from an illegal gambling operation and refusing to pay back his debts. Richard was given the address and told to handle it, no further instructions. He understood exactly what that meant. Richard waited outside the man's apartment for hours, observing his movements. When the man finally stepped outside, Richard followed silently, waited until the street was empty, and approached him from behind. A quick blow to the head with a steel pike dropped the man instantly. Richard dragged the body into an alley and left it where he knew it wouldn't be discovered for days. The next morning, he woke up, made himself breakfast, and went about his day as if nothing had happened. To him, it was just another task completed, nothing personal, nothing emotional. This was the point of no return. From here on, Richard's life would spiral deeper into darkness. Each job made him more confident, more efficient, and more invisible. He discovered that he had a rare gift. He could kill without hesitation, without remorse, and without leaving behind a single clue. Word began to spread quietly among the criminal networks in New Jersey and New York. There was a man in Jersey City who could make problems disappear. By the mid-1950s, Richard had committed several killings tied directly to disputes over money, gambling, and respect. Some were personal, others were for pay, but all of them served to cement his reputation. He understood now that he was different from most men. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others feared consequences, he calculated risks. And where others broke down afterward, Richard felt nothing. In later prison interviews, when asked what drove him to kill so many people, Richard's answer was chillingly simple. It was business. If I had to do it, I did it. I never thought about it twice. This detachment wasn't an act. It was a defining part of his psychology, one that allowed him to operate in a world where silence and efficiency meant survival. Yet, beneath the growing notoriety, Richard remained careful. He avoided drawing unnecessary attention to himself, staying away from drugs and flashy spending. He bought modest clothes, kept his head down, and blended into suburban life whenever possible. It was this ability to compartmentalize his existence to be two people at once that made him so dangerous. To his friends, he was loyal and dependable. To his employers, he was reliable and efficient. And to his enemies, he was invisible until the moment he struck. By the late 1950s, Richard had firmly stepped into the orbit of organized crime. The Gambino family, impressed by his cold precision, began offering him higher-paying contracts. These weren't street disputes anymore, they were targeted hits, planned meticulously to send messages or settle debts within the criminal hierarchy. Richard approached each job with the same unshakable calm, carrying them out cleanly and disappearing without a trace. What made Richard particularly valuable was his innovation. He experimented with techniques that others didn't think to use, changing weapons, timing, and locations to ensure no consistent pattern emerged. He learned how to dump bodies in ways that made identification nearly impossible, often using chemical solutions to destroy evidence. While most killers left trails, Richard's victims vanished into the shadows. But even as his efficiency grew, so did the darkness within him. Killing had become second nature. Where once it was about revenge, now it was about control. Richard found an unsettling satisfaction in deciding who lived and who died, a sense of authority that had been denied to him as a child under his father's rule. That desire for dominance, born from years of abuse and fear, was finally being fulfilled, and it only pushed him further. By the time he turned 30, Richard Kuklinski was no longer just a violent young man from Jersey City. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a man who could kill calmly, blend back into society, and sleep peacefully afterward. His world was expanding rapidly, and soon the Mafia would trust him with even bigger jobs, more dangerous contracts, and higher stakes. And yet, in his quiet suburban home, Richard's growing reputation remained invisible to those closest to him. To his neighbors, he was still polite, still reserved, still unremarkable. But in the darkness, the transformation was nearly complete. The boy who had once suffered under his father's fists had become a predator, precise, patient, and increasingly untouchable. This was the dawn of the Iceman. But Richard's rise was far from over. In the years ahead, he would move from small-time enforcer to one of the most prolific and feared contract killers in the American underworld. And his methods, cold, calculated, and shockingly inventive, would earn him a reputation that even the Mafia whispered about. By the early 1960s, Richard Kuklinski had transformed from a troubled street kid into a feared enforcer on the streets of Jersey City. His reputation had grown quietly but steadily. He was known among small-time criminals as someone who didn't bluff, didn't hesitate, and didn't talk. But it wasn't just his violence that set him apart, it was his ability to disappear into the background. He could execute brutal acts of retribution and then blend seamlessly into the quiet rhythm of suburban life. This skill would soon bring him to the attention of far more dangerous and powerful men, the ones who ran New York's criminal underworld. At this time, organized crime in New York and New Jersey was dominated by the five families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno. These were tightly controlled empires built on gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and union racketeering. Business thrived on silence and loyalty, and Richard's personality made him a perfect fit. He didn't seek recognition or power within the organization. He wanted money, stability, and the ability to operate without interference. To the Mafia, that made him useful. Richard's first real contact with the mob came through a small-time Gambino associate named Roy Demio. Demio was a rising star within the Gambino crime family, intelligent, ruthless, and always looking for reliable people who could handle business. Warrior on a crew out of Brooklyn specializing in high-risk jobs, car theft, debt collections, and, when necessary, contract killings. The crew was expanding, and Roy needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't panic, and wouldn't leave loose ends. Richard fit perfectly. Their first meeting was unremarkable, almost casual. Through mutual acquaintances, Richard was introduced to Dino in a bar on Manhattan's West Side. Roy watched him carefully, testing his composure, while Richard kept his usual cold, quiet demeanor. Roy later told associates that he could see it in his eyes. Richard wasn't someone who would hesitate under pressure. Within days, Dino offered him his first significant job, collect a large debt from a nightclub owner who had been avoiding payments for months. Richard accepted without hesitation. He showed up at the nightclub late at night, waited until the owner was alone in his office, and closed the door behind him. According to Richard's later accounts, the man panicked immediately and tried to negotiate, but Richard stayed silent, towering over him, letting the fear build. When the man still refused to pay, Richard struck him once hard enough to leave him bleeding on the floor and gave him 3 days to come up with the money. By the end of the week, the debt was paid in full. Richard never said more than a few words during the entire interaction. Dino took notice. In the Mafia, reliability mattered as much as skill. And Richard wasn't just effective, he was discreet. That first job opened the door to a steady stream of work, at first simple collections and intimidation, but eventually something darker. Richard was gradually pulled deeper into Dino's orbit, becoming one of his trusted outsiders, someone not officially made in the Gambino family, but close enough to be given sensitive jobs. What made Richard stand out was his versatility. He didn't rely on a single method of intimidation or violence. He adapted to the situation, sometimes using blunt force, other times psychological manipulation. He also began experimenting with chemicals, cyanide in particular, after hearing from other criminals that it was fast, effective, and difficult to trace. This would later become one of his trademarks. Around this time, Richard's personal life also began to change. He had married Barbara Padrici, and together they started a family in a quiet New Jersey suburb. To his neighbors, Richard appeared to be the model husband and father. He attended barbecues, played with his children, and kept his lawn neatly trimmed. Barbara, however, knew there was something about him that felt off. He had a temper that could erupt without warning, and he controlled the household with an iron grip. Still, she didn't know the full extent of his double life. By the mid-1960s, Richard had become a regular presence in mob circles. He was frequently seen at bars, pool halls, and backroom meetings with Gambino and Genevieve's associates. He kept his words few, his expressions neutral, and his actions decisive, traits that earned him respect among men who valued silence as much as loyalty. But Richard wasn't just working for the Gambinos. He understood the value of diversifying his connections, and he quietly took on jobs from members of the Genovese crime family as well. This dual role was risky. Working for multiple families was dangerous in a world where loyalty was everything, but Richard navigated it carefully. He wasn't trying to climb the ranks of either organization. He was a contractor, a specialist, a man hired to solve problems no one else wanted to handle. One of his most infamous early hits for the Mafia came in 1967. A Gambino associate had stolen money from the wrong people and was hiding out in a motel in upstate New York. Richard was given the details along with one clear instruction: make it clean. No noise. No mess. Richard drove upstate, scouted the area, and waited until nightfall. He entered the room quietly, carrying nothing but a small revolver. According to his later accounts, the man was asleep when he approached. One precise shot to the head, followed by a quick wipe down of the surfaces, and Richard was gone. By the time the motel staff discovered the body, there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no trace of who had been there. This level of precision set Richard apart from other killers. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't boast about his work. And unlike many mob enforcers, he never took pleasure in chaos or drama. For him, it was business, efficient, cold, and silent. His reputation began to spread beyond New Jersey, reaching bosses and underbosses in New York who viewed him as one of the most dependable freelancers available. It was also during this period that Richard began experimenting with one of the techniques that would eventually make him infamous: freezing bodies to disguise time of death. He discovered this method after helping Demio handle a particularly problematic situation involving a rival bookmaker. The man was killed, but Demio didn't want the body found too soon. Richard suggested freezing it, and the plan worked flawlessly. When the body was eventually discovered, investigators miscalculated the time of death by weeks, throwing off the entire investigation. From that moment on, Richard realized that control over evidence was just as important as control over the act itself. Despite his growing involvement in organized crime, Richard remained careful to maintain the appearance of normalcy at home. He attended church with his family, drove his children to school, and even volunteered for local events. He relished the idea of being underestimated by everyone around him. To the outside world, he was just another hard-working husband providing for his family. In reality, he was becoming one of the most feared contract killers on the East Coast. But beneath his calm exterior, something darker was taking root. Killing no longer felt like necessity or survival, it had become routine. The line between personal and professional violence blurred. Richard no longer needed a reason, he operated on instinct. If someone disrespected him, crossed a boundary, or posed a threat, they simply ceased to exist. By the late 1960s, Richard had fully entered the inner circle of Demio's operations. He had handled dozens of jobs, collections, intimidation, and targeted hits, without a single arrest or serious police inquiry. Law enforcement, at this point, barely knew his name. To them, Richard Kuklinski was invisible. This invisibility was his greatest weapon. While other killers sought recognition or protection from the Mafia, Richard's value came from being untouchable. A man who could operate outside the formal structure of the five families while still earning their trust. But that same independence would later put him in conflict with the very people who relied on his services. The 1970s would mark a turning point. As the mob wars intensified and power struggles escalated between families, Richard's role would grow even more critical and more dangerous. Bigger jobs, higher stakes, and deadlier consequences were waiting. The quiet contractor from Jersey City was becoming something else entirely, the Iceman, the man who could make anyone vanish without leaving a trace. By the early 1970s, Richard Kuklinski was no longer just a freelancer taking small jobs for organized crime. He had evolved into one of the most reliable contract killers on the East Coast, a man whose reputation spread quietly through the halls of Brooklyn bars, Jersey backrooms, and Manhattan social clubs. Within these circles, his name rarely came up in casual conversation, but when it did, it carried weight. Among those who knew him, there was an unspoken understanding. Richard handled problems permanently. His partnership with Roy Demio had become central to his rise. Demio, now a key figure within the Gambino crime family, valued Richard's precision, silence, and willingness to innovate. While many mob enforcers relied on brute force and intimidation, Richard elevated killing into something calculated, a process to be planned, executed, and erased. For Demio, who ran operations involving everything from car theft to large-scale loan sharking, Richard was the perfect tool for situations where loose ends could not be tolerated. It was during this period that Richard refined the techniques that would define his career. He was no longer the impulsive street fighter or the angry young man avenging personal insults. Instead, he had transformed into a professional, meticulous, methodical, and frighteningly creative in how he approached each job. His ability to adapt to any situation made him invaluable to Dino and others in the Mafia's inner circles. One of his signature methods, which later earned him the nickname the Iceman, emerged from his obsession with controlling every possible variable in a murder investigation. Richard discovered that by freezing bodies after a killing, he could confuse forensic timelines, making it nearly impossible for investigators to determine the time of death. He tested this technique in the early 70s during a hit ordered by Dino. A mid-level bookmaker who had been skimming profits disappeared one night, and his frozen body wasn't discovered until weeks later. When authorities finally recovered it, they believed the man had died much more recently than he actually had. That discrepancy gave Richard confidence and a signature. But Richard wasn't satisfied with just one method. He understood that patterns could get a killer caught, so he deliberately avoided repeating the same approach twice. Sometimes it was a gun, sometimes a knife, sometimes cyanide slipped into food or drinks. Cyanide, in particular, became one of his trademarks. He admired its efficiency, odorless, tasteless, and nearly impossible to trace in an autopsy unless specifically tested for. Richard carried small vials of the substance hidden inside his pockets and, when necessary, could end a life with nothing more than a handshake, a glass of wine, or a piece of food. During interviews years later, Richard spoke about cyanide almost casually, describing it as clean and simple. To him, it wasn't murder in the traditional sense, it was problem-solving. One moment, someone was there, the next, they weren't. No blood, no mess, no evidence, just silence. That cold detachment, the ability to talk about death as though it were paperwork, terrified even hardened mobsters who relied on his services. Richard's rise also coincided with the growing influence of Dino's crew within the Gambino family. By now, Dino operated out of the infamous Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn, where many mob hits were planned and executed. Richard became a frequent visitor, though he was never an official member of the Gambino organization. This outsider status gave him a unique advantage. He wasn't bound by the traditional rules of loyalty, hierarchy, or ceremony. He could take jobs from multiple families, Gambino, Genovese, even Lucchese, without becoming deeply entangled in their politics. The Gemini Lounge itself became a hub of Richard's activity. Inside its unassuming brick walls, deals were made, disputes were settled, and hits were ordered in whispers over glasses of whiskey. The lounge had its own grisly reputation, as Dino's crew was notorious for their efficiency in disposing of bodies, dismembering victims, bagging the parts, and sending them off to be incinerated or dumped in remote locations. While Richard didn't always participate in the Gemini crew's internal hits, he learned from their methods and perfected his own, blending their brutal practicality with his obsession for control and secrecy. By this time, Richard's income skyrocketed. He charged between $10,000 and $20,000 per contract, depending on the complexity of the job. With that money, he moved his family into a comfortable home in Dumont, New Jersey, where his double life became even more surreal. To his neighbors, he was still quiet and polite, always waving from his driveway and hosting occasional backyard barbecues. His children adored him. Barbara, his wife, knew he worked in business but avoided asking questions about the long absences, sudden influxes of cash, and unexplained tension that followed him like a shadow. Despite his growing success, Richard wasn't reckless. He prided himself on discipline: no drugs, no drinking, no gambling. Unlike many mob associates who self-destructed through excess, Richard treated killing like a trade, and tradesmen needed steady hands. His restraint made him stand out in a world filled with unpredictable personalities. Even Dino himself, though close to Richard, was often unsettled by his calmness after particularly violent jobs. In one chilling story, Richard recalled a hit where he lured a man into a secluded area under the guise of discussing business. As they walked together, Richard calmly slipped cyanide into the man's drink and watched him collapse moments later. Without breaking stride, he carried on the conversation with another associate standing nearby, as though nothing had happened. The associate later told others that it was like watching someone flip a switch, 1 second alive, the next gone, but Richard's growing confidence also made him more selective. He no longer accepted every job that came his way, preferring contracts where discretion and planning were valued over brute force. He avoided chaotic, high-risk hits in favor of those that could be executed silently with minimal exposure. Over time, his name became synonymous with professionalism. Of course, notoriety has a price. As Richard's reputation spread, he began attracting attention from law enforcement. Detectives in New Jersey and New York noticed the increasing number of unsolved disappearances linked, at least loosely, to people connected to the Gambino and Genovese families. But Richard's meticulous approach kept him untouchable for now. There were no witnesses, no weapons, no patterns, nothing investigators could hold onto. Inside the underworld, however, his legend grew. By the mid-1970s, whispers of the Iceman circulated among both allies and enemies. The nickname, first used quietly within Dino's crew, reflected both his method of freezing bodies and his chilling lack of emotion. Those who worked alongside him described him as cold as stone, a man who could look directly into someone's eyes and show nothing at all. For many, that was more terrifying than the violence itself. And yet, Richard's personal life remained a strange contrast to the darkness of his work. He attended church with his family on Sundays. He hosted birthday parties for his children. He mowed his lawn, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors, and even played the role of a doting father. The dichotomy between his public image and his private actions made him nearly impossible to suspect, a predator hidden in plain sight. As his techniques evolved, so did his independence. Richard began taking on larger, more complex jobs outside of Dino's immediate influence, including high-profile hits involving rival mobsters, loan sharks, and informants. Each success deepened his status as one of the most effective killers for hire in the American underworld. But his growing autonomy would eventually create tension with Dino and other Gambino leaders, who disliked the idea of someone so skilled and so feared operating beyond their full control. By the late 1970s, Richard had perfected his craft. He could kill silently in crowded spaces, slip poison into a drink at a bar, stage accidents convincingly, or make people disappear entirely. His innovation in body disposal, from using industrial freezers to dumping remains in remote swamps, frustrated investigators for years. Within the Mafia, his success solidified his place as an asset too valuable to lose, but also too dangerous to cross. Behind the cold precision, however, a subtle shift was beginning. Killing had once been business. Now, for Richard, it was becoming habit. The line between necessity and compulsion blurred. In interviews years later, he admitted casually that sometimes he killed simply because he didn't like someone's face or the way they looked at me. The efficiency remained, but the restraint was fading. The rise of the Iceman was nearly complete. He had become a ghost within organized crime, a man who left no traces, whose name appeared nowhere on paper, and yet whose presence was felt in every corner of the underworld. But as the contracts became larger and the stakes higher, Richard's growing notoriety would attract new dangers, not just from law enforcement, but from the very men who once relied on his silence. And soon, Even Richard Kaplinski's carefully constructed double life would begin to fracture under the weight of secrets too dark to hide forever. By the late 1970s, Richard Kaplinski had perfected the art of living two completely separate lives. On one side was the feared contract killer, the Iceman, whose name carried weight in New York and New Jersey's criminal underworld. On the other side was the suburban husband and father, the man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays, attended church with his family on Sundays, and smiled politely at neighbors during backyard barbecues. To outsiders, he looked like an ordinary family man. But beneath the surface, his two worlds were colliding, and the pressure of keeping them apart was shaping the darkness that defined him. Richard had moved his family into a comfortable home in Dumont, New Jersey. It was the kind of quiet neighborhood where children played outside until dusk, where mailboxes lined manicured lawns, and where people believed they knew the lives of those around them. To the neighbors, Richard was polite, soft-spoken, and attentive to his wife and children. He was the man who helped carry groceries, who waved as he backed his car out of the driveway, who smiled faintly but rarely lingered for small talk. If anyone wondered where his sudden wealth came from, they kept their thoughts to themselves. At home, Richard's life revolved around his wife Barbara and their 3 children, Merrick, Kristen, and Dwayne. Barbara saw in Richard both stability and control. He provided well for the family, always ensuring that bills were paid and that they never wanted for anything. But there was a darker side to that control, one that left everyone in the house walking carefully around his moods. Barbara later described him as a man of extremes, tender and affectionate at times, then cold and frighteningly silent at others. When his temper flared, it was explosive, objects smashed, threats shouted, a tension so thick that even the children knew when to stay quiet. Yet Barbara also admitted that she avoided questioning him. She didn't ask where the money came from, where he went late at night, or why he sometimes returned home with blood on his shirt or knuckles raw. In her mind, silence was safer than answers. Richard encouraged this distance deliberately. He built walls between his family and his work, convinced them that the less they knew, the more protected they were. And perhaps, deep down, he also knew that sharing the truth would shatter the illusion of normalcy he clung to so tightly. This double life wasn't just an act, it was part of Richard's identity. In one world, he was a provider, a father who took pride in giving his children the kind of upbringing he never had. He bought them toys, took them to the park, and cherished small rituals like Sunday breakfasts and birthday parties. In the other world, he was an efficient killer, carrying out assignments for the Gambino and Genovese crime families with chilling precision. To Richard, these lives didn't conflict, they balanced each other. He believed he could be both things at once, compartmentalizing his violence so completely that the people closest to him would never see the monster behind the mask. But cracks were forming beneath the surface. As Richard's work for the Mafia grew, so did the emotional distance within his marriage. Barbara later recalled long stretches where Richard became withdrawn, speaking little and isolating himself in the basement for hours. She sensed that something deeper was brewing inside him, but whenever she pressed him, he would dismiss her with a cold stare or a sharp remark. The children, meanwhile, grew up in an environment where unpredictability was the norm, a father who could be playful and generous one day, then terrifyingly volatile the next. Inside, Richard wrestled with something he rarely admitted. He felt the weight of being two different people. The act of switching between roles became second nature, but the mental strain never fully disappeared. He took comfort in rituals that reinforced his control, polishing his tools meticulously, cleaning weapons after jobs, and carefully hiding evidence in secure locations. To Richard, routine wasn't just practical, it was calming. Chaos outside the home was manageable because inside, everything was organized, and silent. Yet, despite his efforts, small fragments of his other life occasionally slipped through. There were moments when Barbara noticed the faint chemical smell of cyanide on his clothes or when neighbors spotted strange visitors arriving at odd hours. Once, when Barbara confronted him about a late-night meeting, Richard snapped so violently that she never asked again. Fear became the foundation of their relationship, an unspoken agreement that her survival, and their children's, depended on staying out of his business. Richard's paranoia also began to grow during this time. As law enforcement intensified its focus on organized crime in New York and New Jersey, Richard knew he had to be careful. He started installing security measures at home, always checking the locks, scanning the street before stepping outside, and teaching his children strict rules about privacy. They were forbidden from answering questions about their father, no matter who asked. To the children, this secrecy became normal. They didn't know what he did, only that talking about it was dangerous. The more deeply Richard became entangled in Mafia operations, the more his methods evolved. He began conducting meetings in public parks instead of offices, preferring open spaces where he could spot potential threats. He avoided using phones whenever possible, fearing wiretaps, and developed an almost obsessive habit of watching his rearview mirror while driving. Richard thrived in control, but now he also lived with the constant sense of being hunted, by the law, by rivals, and perhaps by his own escalating impulses. Ironically, his growing reputation made maintaining his double life even harder. Within the underworld, whispers about the Iceman were spreading. Among mobsters, his efficiency was legendary, and yet to the neighbors in Dumont, Richard was still the soft-spoken father who shoveled snow in the winter and handed out candy on Halloween. This contrast fascinated him. He enjoyed knowing that people around him saw only what he wanted them to see, that they lived alongside one of the most feared contract killers in the country without ever suspecting a thing. But being to people came at a cost. The constant compartmentalization, shifting from father to killer and back again, wore on him over time. His temper at home grew shorter, his patience thinner. Barbara later said that while he never openly admitted what he did, the house itself began to feel haunted by secrets. Doors slammed for no reason, arguments erupted over small things, and silence settled into the walls like a permanent guest. Even so, Richard kept providing, believing that money excused everything. He paid for private schools, expensive gifts, and vacations meant to reassure his family that they were safe and cared for. He believed that material comfort balanced out emotional distance, that love could be measured in security rather than intimacy. For a while, Barbara played along, accepting the comforts while ignoring the growing darkness that seemed to follow her husband wherever he went. Outside the home, Richard's role in the criminal world continued to expand. By now, he was no longer just a hired gun. He was trusted with sensitive jobs involving rival mobsters, debt disputes, and suspected informants. He coordinated with Roy DeMeo but also took independent contracts, building relationships across multiple families without pledging allegiance to any single one. That independence gave him freedom but also created enemies. Among some Gambino associates, resentment grew quietly. Richard was too skilled, too well-paid, and too untouchable for their liking. This tension would eventually become dangerous, but for now Richard thrived in the shadows. He used his anonymity to his advantage, carefully avoiding any unnecessary attention from both the police and the press. Still, he couldn't fully control what others whispered about him, and even within his own family, there were moments when suspicion crept too close to the surface. Barbara once recalled a chilling night when Richard returned home unusually late, his clothes spattered faintly with something dark. When she hesitated before approaching him, he looked at her with the same cold detachment she'd seen only a handful of times. Without raising his voice, he told her, "Don't ask. You don't want the answer." She never forgot that moment. It was the line she would never cross again. By the end of the decade, Richard Kaplinski had succeeded in building the perfect Fawade, a man who could walk between two worlds without leaving footprints in either. To the outside world, he was a quiet father raising his children in the suburbs. To the Mafia, he was an indispensable weapon, a specialist whose silence and precision made him worth every dollar. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, a storm was building. The pressures of secrecy, control, and constant violence were starting to take their toll. What Richard didn't yet realize was that his double life was becoming increasingly unsustainable. The more he killed, the more evidence piled up in shadows he thought no one would ever search. Law enforcement was beginning to close in, and within the Mafia, old alliances were shifting. For years, Richard believed he could live in two worlds without consequence. But soon, those worlds would collide in ways even he couldn't predict. By the early 1980s, Richard Kaplinski had reached the height of his criminal career. Among the shadows of New York and New Jersey's underworld, his name had transformed into something more than just a rumor. It was an unspoken warning. Inside Mafia circles, he was regarded as one of the most efficient, most discreet, and most untraceable contract killers operating on the East Coast. But what made Richard truly dangerous wasn't just his ability to kill. It was his ability to vanish afterward, to erase every trace of his involvement until even seasoned investigators were left with nothing but questions. Law enforcement had started to take notice of an alarming pattern. Over the course of more than a decade, dozens of mob-related figures, small-time hustlers, loan defaulters, and witnesses had disappeared or turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. The police struggled to connect the dots because there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and rarely even a body. Whenever someone mentioned the Iceman, it was always in hushed tones, as though speaking his name aloud might make him appear. Richard's unmatched success came from his obsession with control and his relentless innovation. While other mob hitmen relied on the same basic techniques, a bullet in the head, a shallow grave, a river dump, Richard understood that patterns were dangerous. He deliberately avoided repetition, switching methods constantly to make each killing unique. Sometimes he used knives or blunt objects, other times he relied on carefully planned accidents, but his most infamous technique was poison, specifically cyanide. Richard discovered cyanide in the mid-1970s and quickly adopted it as his preferred weapon when discretion mattered most. He called it clean and efficient. It was odorless, tasteless, and nearly impossible to detect unless specifically tested for. He could slip it into a drink, lace food with it, or even administer it as a spray. One story he shared years later described how he walked up to a man, offered him a cigarette laced with cyanide, and watched calmly as the man collapsed just minutes later. To Richard, it was business, efficient, silent, and bloodless. When asked in interviews why he favored cyanide, Richard's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. It was quiet. It worked. Nobody knew what happened until it was too late. There was no emotion, no thrill, no pleasure, just process. To Richard, a life ended as cleanly as a light switched off. But Richard's ingenuity went beyond how he killed. It extended to what happened afterward. He was fascinated by forensic science and constantly looked for ways to outmaneuver investigators. His now infamous technique of freezing bodies earned him his nickname, the Iceman, by placing victims into industrial freezers immediately after death. He could delay decomposition and throw off time of death estimates by weeks or even months. Investigators relied on these timelines to build cases, and Richard exploited that weakness perfectly. One case in particular highlighted his mastery. A mob-connected loan shark disappeared after failing to pay his debts. When the man's body was eventually discovered months later, medical examiners initially believed he had died only a few days earlier, leading the investigation in the wrong direction entirely. It wasn't until years later, after Richard's arrest, that authorities realized the body had been frozen to obscure evidence. At the time, no one had ever seen such precision. Richard also became known for his ability to stage deaths convincingly as accidents. If someone needed to disappear without drawing attention, he would orchestrate elaborate scenarios: car crashes, overdoses, drownings, each designed to mislead investigators. In some cases, he went as far as placing bodies in different locations or mutilating identifying features to ensure they couldn't be traced. He thought like both a killer and a detective, anticipating what investigators would look for and eliminating every possible clue. Within the underworld, Richard's reputation grew to legendary status. Mafia bosses and high-ranking associates whispered about his efficiency, and his name carried weight even among men who thrived on violence. If Richard was sent after someone, there was no negotiation, no escape, and no second chances. Yet, paradoxically, he wasn't feared in the same way other mob killers were. He didn't shout, didn't posture, and rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than threats. Richard's discipline also set him apart. Unlike many hitmen who lived recklessly, gambling away earnings, flaunting expensive cars, or drawing attention in nightclubs, Richard preferred a quiet, controlled existence. He lived modestly in Dumont, New Jersey, investing money carefully and avoiding unnecessary risks. He rarely drank, avoided drugs entirely, and never allowed himself to become sloppy. To him, a lack of discipline was dangerous. The stakes got people caught. However, his independence made him both valuable and vulnerable. Unlike most enforcers, Richard was never officially made into the Gambino or Genovese families. He remained an outsider, a contractor who worked with multiple crews but belonged to none. That autonomy allowed him to accept higher-paying jobs from competing factions, but it also created quiet resentment among those who saw him as uncontrollable. Inside Mafia politics, loyalty was everything, and Richard's refusal to fully commit to one family eventually drew suspicion. Even Roy DiMeo, once his closest ally, began to see the risks. DiMeo valued Richard's precision but worried about his growing influence and unpredictability. The Mafia's unwritten rules dictated that men like Richard, those too independent, too skilled, and too feared, eventually became liabilities. For now, though, Richard's usefulness outweighed the threat he posed. Despite the danger surrounding his work, Richard remained untouchable to law enforcement. Investigators tried for years to connect him to missing persons cases, unsolved murders, and organized crime hits, but every trail went cold. Without witnesses or physical evidence, he was little more than a ghost. Detectives privately admitted frustration, describing him as the perfect killer, someone who understood their playbook better than they did. Meanwhile, Richard continued expanding his methods. He became obsessed with efficiency, experimenting with timing tools and substances to ensure each job left nothing behind. He tested weapons in secluded areas, studied how bodies decomposed under different conditions, and stayed informed about forensic advancements so he could stay one step ahead. For him, killing was no longer just a business, it was a craft, and he was perfecting it. But beneath his controlled exterior, cracks were beginning to form. Years of compartmentalizing his double life, family man and contract killer, had started to take a toll. Barbara noticed subtle changes. He became more withdrawn, less patient, and quicker to anger at home. While Richard remained careful to shield his children from his darker side, the strain of secrecy made him increasingly unpredictable behind closed doors. There were also signs that Richard was starting to blur the line between professional hits and personal impulses. In interviews years later, he admitted that not every killing was for money. Sometimes, he acted simply because someone insulted him or made him feel disrespected. A glance, a word, a perceived slight for Richard, these were enough to justify taking a life. While he claimed he never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, his definition of deserving was fluid and entirely his own. This growing volatility didn't go unnoticed by the people around him. Within the Mafia, some began to view him as unpredictable, even dangerous to his allies. Outside the underworld, detectives were finally beginning to catch whispers about an elusive figure operating in New Jersey and New York, a man tied to dozens, maybe hundreds, of disappearances but leaving no trace behind. For the first time, Richard's name appeared quietly in investigative files, though nothing concrete linked him to a single crime. Despite the increasing scrutiny, Richard thrived on his ability to stay invisible. He kept his routine simple, avoided flashy spending, and refused to draw attention in public. Even when whispers of the Iceman reached federal investigators, they struggled to find solid ground. Without physical evidence, he was untouchable, a phantom in the system. Yet, the perfect killer wasn't invincible. By the early 1980s, Richard's growing independence and reputation placed him in a dangerous position within the Mafia hierarchy. The families who once relied on him began quietly questioning his loyalty, wondering if a man so skilled and so secretive could one day become a threat. And while Richard dismissed these tensions at the time, they would later set in motion events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. For now, though, Richard stood at the peak of his power, feared by enemies, respected by employers, and invisible to law enforcement. He had perfected his craft, built a facade of normalcy around his family, and refined methods so sophisticated that even seasoned detectives couldn't keep up. To outsiders, he seemed untouchable. But beneath the surface, the storm was already building. In the shadows of Dumont and Brooklyn, quiet conversations were beginning, whispers of betrayal, suspicion, and shifting loyalties. Richard had spent decades mastering the art of disappearing. But soon, the same silence that protected him would draw him deeper into a game where trust meant nothing, and survival depended on staying ahead of everyone, including his own allies. By the mid-1980s, Richard Kaplinski had spent over 2 decades living in the shadows, balancing his two identities, a feared contract killer and an ordinary suburban father. For years, his precision, discipline, and silence had made him untouchable. Law enforcement had tried to connect him to dozens of unsolved murders, but without witnesses, patterns, or forensic evidence, the Iceman remained a ghost. Inside the Mafia, his reputation was unquestioned. If Richard took a job, it got done. But power and invisibility come with a cost. And by this point, small cracks had begun to form in the carefully constructed facade Richard had built around his life. Several factors converged to set the stage for Richard's downfall. The first came from within the Mafia itself. By 1983, tensions between the Gambino and Genovese families were escalating, and Richard's independence, once his greatest strength, began to make him a liability. He had worked for multiple families, often without telling one what he was doing for the other, and while his discretion protected him for years, it also meant no single family truly owned him. In a world built on loyalty, being a freelancer in constant demand made Richard both valuable and dangerous. Quietly, resentment began to build. Roy DiMeo, once Richard's closest ally, had become a source of unease. DiMeo's crew was unraveling under the weight of FBI investigations into the Gambino family's activities, and DiMeo himself had become increasingly paranoid. He worried about informants, wiretaps, and shifting alliances, and that paranoia extended to Richard. Demio knew better than anyone how skilled Richard was and how much he knew. If Richard ever decided to cooperate with law enforcement, he could expose secrets that could bring down half of Brooklyn's criminal network. In Demio's world, that kind of knowledge was dangerous, no matter how loyal the man holding it claimed to be. Meanwhile, federal authorities were intensifying their focus on organized crime. Under the RICO Act, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, investigators were finally dismantling long-standing protections for the five families. Dozens of mobsters were being arrested, and plea deals were cutting deeper into the heart of New York's criminal empires than ever before. For the first time, Richard's name surfaced quietly in investigative files, never officially accused, but flagged as a possible link to numerous disappearances connected to the Gambinos and Genoveses. Despite these growing dangers, Richard continued working. His precision and reliability still made him indispensable, and for a while, it seemed like business as usual. But something had shifted inside him. He was no longer just carrying out contracts. He was making decisions based on his own impulses, sometimes killing without orders, sometimes targeting people who had simply angered him. That subtle but critical change made him unpredictable, even by Mafia standards. Barbara, his wife, noticed the change long before anyone else. At home, Richard had always been distant, but now he seemed haunted. He spent longer hours alone in the basement, sharpening blades, cleaning tools, and disappearing on business trips without explanation. His temper grew shorter, his paranoia more intense. He started double-checking locks, scanning their quiet suburban street for unmarked cars, and teaching the children to never talk to strangers, even though they didn't know what they were supposed to keep secret. Barbara's unease grew, but years of living under Richard's shadow had taught her not to ask questions she didn't want answers to. Then, in 1983, a turning point came with the death of Roy Demio himself. Demio's body was found stuffed into the trunk of his car, riddled with bullets, the result of an internal Gambino power struggle. With his closest ally gone, Richard lost his primary connection to the upper echelons of the Mafia. Demio's death also destabilized the delicate balance Richard had maintained for years. Without Demio's protection, whispers about his independence grew louder, and rival associates began questioning whether he could still be trusted. At the same time, law enforcement was finally beginning to close in. A task force made up of local detectives, federal agents, and prosecutors began reviewing cold cases across New Jersey and New York. They noticed something unusual. Dozens of victims tied to gambling disputes, loan defaults, and mafia skimming operations had disappeared, yet no consistent suspect had ever been identified. There was no direct evidence linking Richard to these cases, but small fragments, eyewitness descriptions, vague rumors, unexplained patterns began forming the outline of someone who operated outside traditional mafia structures. By 1984, Richard's paranoia reached new heights. He became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, including his closest associates. He started vetting even minor interactions, carefully studying expressions, tone, and intent. He changed routines constantly, altering driving routes, swapping vehicles, and rotating meeting locations to avoid potential surveillance. Yet no matter how careful he was, Richard couldn't fully control the danger closing in from multiple sides, mafia distrust on one hand, federal investigations on the other. His methods also began attracting more attention than he intended. In one particularly notable case, the frozen body of a small-time associate turned up in a remote area. Forensic experts struggled to estimate time of death accurately, but a sharp-eyed medical examiner noticed inconsistencies in tissue preservation, subtle signs of artificial freezing. While Richard wasn't immediately suspected, This discovery marked the beginning of a quiet but determined effort to track down whoever was capable of such sophistication. For investigators, it was the first real clue that someone different, someone meticulous, was operating in their jurisdiction. Even within his carefully constructed double life, the pressure began spilling over into his personal world. Barbara recalled nights when Richard would wake suddenly, drenched in sweat, gripping a knife he kept near the bed. He began pacing the house at night, checking doors and windows, convinced that someone was coming for him. The children learned to stay silent during these episodes, sensing the tension, but never daring to ask questions. What had once been a fragile balance between family man and contract killer was becoming impossible to maintain. In the underworld, Richard's reputation was shifting in dangerous ways. Where he had once been respected for his discipline and reliability, he was now viewed by some as a potential threat. Rumors circulated that he had become too independent, too secretive, and too dangerous to be left unchecked. Some Gambino associates quietly suggested that cleaning up Richard might be the safest solution. Others believed that trying to take him out would be suicide. Among men who lived by violence, fear was Richard's most effective shield, but it also isolated him further, cutting him off from the very network that had once protected him. By 1985, Richard's name had surfaced repeatedly in FBI discussions about unexplained disappearances in New Jersey. While there was still no solid evidence tying him to any single crime, investigators suspected they were dealing with someone who had perfected the art of vanishing without a trace. This growing interest led to the creation of a joint federal-state investigation focused specifically on organized crime contract killings. And Richard's name was placed quietly at the top of their watch list. Despite the walls closing in, Richard remained convinced that his discipline would keep him safe. He doubled down on secrecy, limiting contact even with longtime associates, and began vetting jobs more carefully than ever before. But the game was changing in ways he couldn't fully control. The FBI had begun using undercover operatives and wiretaps more aggressively, embedding informants within the very families Richard worked for. And one of those informants would ultimately prove to be his undoing. This man was Dominic Polifroni, a federal agent working deep undercover. Disguised as a high-level mobster looking for a reliable hitman, Polifroni sought out Richard directly, posing as someone in need of a specialist who could handle delicate work. At first, Richard was cautious, testing Polifroni's knowledge and watching his reactions closely. But over time, as Richard grew more isolated and desperate for trusted contacts after Demio's death, he began to lower his guard. The conversations between Richard and Polifroni would eventually become the key to unraveling years of unsolved cases. But in 1985, Richard had no idea he was being drawn into an elaborate trap. For the first time in his life, the perfect killer was about to make a critical mistake. He believed he was still invisible. In the darkness of suburban Dumont, Richard continued living his double life, unaware that law enforcement had already begun closing the circle around him. His neighbors still waved as he drove past in his quiet, unassuming car. His children still hugged him goodnight. His wife still avoided the questions that haunted her. But in the shadows beyond the trimmed hedges and calm streets, the beginning of the end had already arrived. The next stage of Richard's story would no longer be about perfection. It would be about betrayal, surveillance, and the slow, deliberate dismantling of a man who had spent his life believing he could control everything and everyone around him. By 1985, Richard Kaplinski's carefully constructed double life was starting to collapse. For over 2 decades, he had lived undetected, existing simultaneously as a suburban husband and father in Dumont, New Jersey, and as one of the most efficient contract killers on the East Coast. He believed he had perfected his craft, No witnesses, no forensic trails, no mistakes. But while Richard thought he was still invisible, law enforcement was moving quietly against him, assembling a strategy unlike anything he had faced before. The turning point came when a joint task force composed of the New Jersey State Police, the FBI, and the ATF was formed specifically to target organized crime contract killings. For years, investigators had been frustrated by an unusual pattern: dozens of unexplained disappearances and unsolved murders connected to gambling debts, loan disputes, and mafia skimming operations. While no direct evidence linked Richard to any of them, whispers in the underworld consistently pointed in the same direction. Someone in New Jersey had developed a level of precision and control unlike anything they had ever seen. The task force needed a breakthrough. They knew Richard was cautious, disciplined, and uncommonly paranoid. Following him wouldn't work. He constantly changed routes, switched cars, and used counter-surveillance techniques. Pressuring associates wouldn't work either. Richard had built his entire career on silence and intimidation, and those who crossed him rarely survived long enough to talk. The investigators needed something different, someone who could infiltrate Richard's world, gain his trust, and catch him in the act. Enter Dominic Polifrone, an undercover federal agent with years of experience infiltrating organized crime. Polifrone was chosen specifically for his calm demeanor, deep knowledge of mafia operations, and ability to play the role of a connected wise guy convincingly. His assignment was simple in theory but extraordinarily dangerous in practice: get close enough to Richard to gather direct evidence of his involvement in contract killings, preferably on tape. Posing as a mobster looking for a reliable hitman, Polifrone approached Richard through mutual criminal contacts. At first, Richard was wary, as he always was with newcomers. He watched Dominic carefully, testing his knowledge of mafia codes and hierarchy, searching for any sign of weakness or deception. Over several staged meetings at diners, bars, and parking lots, Dominic built rapport slowly, presenting himself as someone connected to high-level New York figures who needed special work handled discreetly. The FBI recorded every interaction. Hidden microphones captured the details as Richard began to lower his guard. One of the earliest breakthroughs came when Polifrone hinted at needing a clean, undetectable method of killing someone who couldn't leave a mess. Without hesitation, Richard told him about cyanide. Calmly, as though discussing a business deal, Richard explained how he could use a spray, a pill, or even a cigarette to end someone's life quietly and efficiently. He described the effects in detail: the timing, the physical reactions, the doses, demonstrating an intimate knowledge investigators had long suspected but never heard directly from him. Polifrone played his role carefully, acting impressed without appearing too eager. Over time, Richard began to speak more openly about his work. He bragged in his measured, emotionless way about making problems disappear, about freezing bodies to throw off investigators, about the hundreds of people he claimed to have killed. Investigators knew not all his claims were verifiable, but the recordings provided exactly what they needed: first-hand evidence of his methods, intentions, and willingness to commit murder for hire. As the operation intensified, the task force decided they needed Richard caught in the act to eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. They planned an elaborate sting. Polifrone would ask Richard to carry out a hit using cyanide, providing him with a small amount of what he believed was the poison. The plan was to catch Richard preparing for the job, arrest him immediately, and lock down every piece of evidence before he had a chance to cover his tracks. But there was a risk. Richard was unpredictable, intelligent, and extremely dangerous. If he suspected even for a moment that he was being set up, he wouldn't hesitate to kill Polifrone on the spot. The undercover agent later admitted in interviews that he often carried his own concealed weapon during their meetings, fully prepared for the possibility that Richard might turn on him? The trap was set in December 1986. Polifrone arranged a meeting with Richard to finalize the details of the supposed hit. The location was a diner in North Bergen, New Jersey, chosen carefully to allow surveillance teams to monitor from nearby. Hidden cameras captured Richard's arrival, his calm demeanor unchanged as he slid into the booth across from Polifrone. During the conversation, Polifrone provided Richard with a vial containing what Richard believed to be cyanide, but was actually harmless. Richard took it without hesitation, placing it into his pocket and discussing how he would administer it. He described step by step what he planned to do: slip the poison into the target's drink, dispose of the body, and vanish without a trace. It was everything investigators needed. The following morning, December 17, 1986, the task force executed its plan. Dozens of agents surrounded Richard's car as he prepared to leave his home in Dumont. With rifles aimed and tactical units in position, they ordered him out of the vehicle. For the first time in decades, the man who had lived like a ghost was visible, standing silently on the suburban street as neighbors watched in stunned confusion. Richard didn't resist. He looked at the agents coldly, almost curious, as though calculating his next move even as they cuffed his wrists and led him away. Barbara stood at the doorway of their home, frozen in shock as she watched her husband taken by federal agents. To her and the children, Richard had been a provider, a father, a quiet man with secrets they thought better left unexplored. Now those secrets were spilling into daylight, and the life she thought she knew was collapsing in front of her. In the days following the arrest, investigators searched Richard's home and storage facilities. What they found stunned even seasoned agents. There were weapons, guns, knives, blunt instruments, carefully cleaned and organized. There were chemicals, containers, and equipment suggesting he had experimented extensively with poisons. They discovered notes, ledgers, and fragments of information connecting him to multiple disappearances and suspected killings. Yet even with this trove of circumstantial evidence, investigators knew the strongest weapon they had against Richard was the recordings from Dominic Polifrone. The tapes were damning. In his calm, steady voice, Richard described methods of killing, disposal techniques, and his history with cyanide in chilling detail. One excerpt played later in court captured Richard saying, "It's quiet. You spray it, they go to sleep. No mess, no noise, no problem." Another recording included Richard talking about freezing bodies to delay identification, a technique that had baffled investigators for years. For the first time, the elusive Iceman had incriminated himself, not under pressure, but voluntarily, believing he was speaking to an ally. The sting operation was celebrated internally as one of the most complex and carefully executed in the history of the New Jersey State Police. For years, Richard had evaded investigators through a combination of discipline, paranoia, and sheer skill. But in the end, it wasn't brute force or forensic breakthroughs that brought him down. It was trust, something Richard rarely gave and, in this case, gave to the wrong man. In the days following his arrest, Richard remained silent. Interrogators tried to push him, dangling names and cases, but he offered little more than short, cold responses. He seemed unfazed, even detached, as though already calculating his next move from within the confines of his cell. But while Richard appeared calm, his empire had collapsed overnight. His employers abandoned him, associates cut ties instantly, and the man who once terrified rivals with his silence now stood alone against the weight of the evidence. The trial that followed would reveal far more about Richard's crimes than investigators had ever imagined. Over the next several years, prosecutors would connect him to multiple murders, dozens of disappearances, and methods so sophisticated they would change the way forensic investigators approached organized crime cases. But for Richard, The arrest on that cold December morning marked the beginning of the end, the unraveling of a life built on control, secrecy, and calculated violence. He had spent decades perfecting the art of being untouchable, but in the end, a single mistake brought down the Iceman. The predator, who once believed he could outthink everyone else, had finally been outplayed. Richard Kuklinski's arrest in December 1986 marked the end of his double life and the beginning of one of the most chilling trials in New Jersey's history. For decades, he had operated in the shadows, carrying out contract killings for the Mafia while maintaining the facade of a quiet suburban family man. Now, for the first time, the walls were closing in. The prosecution faced an enormous challenge. Despite Richard's taped conversations with undercover agent Dominic Polifroni, they still needed to connect him to actual murders in order to secure a conviction. They meticulously pieced together decades of circumstantial evidence, missing persons reports, financial records, secret ledgers, and, most importantly, the recordings in which Richard casually described his methods of killing. In March 1988, the trial began. The courtroom was tense, packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had been whispered about in both Mafia circles and law enforcement agencies for years. Richard entered wearing a plain beige sweater and khaki pants, his expression cold and detached, as though the chaos unfolding around him had nothing to do with him at all. The prosecution's strategy relied heavily on the tapes. Jurors listened to Richard calmly describe poisoning people with cyanide, freezing bodies to obscure the time of death, and disposing of victims in ways designed to ensure they were never found. It wasn't just the content of his words that chilled the room, it was his tone. There was no anger, no remorse, no pleasure. He spoke about death as though he were discussing household repairs. At one point, prosecutors played a clip where Richard said, "Killing somebody is the easiest thing in the world. You point and shoot. That's it. I don't give a damn who they are." The jurors shifted uncomfortably, several visibly shaken. One later said it felt like listening to death talk to you. The defense tried to portray Richard as exaggerating, suggesting he had inflated his body count to impress Polifroni. They argued that while Richard had undoubtedly been involved in organized crime, there was little physical evidence tying him to the dozens, even hundreds, of killings he claimed. But the combination of his confessions, witness testimonies, and forensic analysis of recovered bodies built a damning case. In 1988, Richard Kuklinski was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The judge called him a remorseless, calculating killer and described his actions as beyond comprehension. Richard sat motionless, his face impassive as the sentence was read. But the story didn't end there. After his conviction, Richard began giving a series of interviews from prison that shocked the public even more than the trial itself. Over hours of footage, he spoke candidly about his life as a contract killer, providing details investigators had never uncovered and stories too horrifying to believe. He claimed to have killed over 200 people during his career, though experts remain divided on the exact number. Some believe he exaggerated. Others suspect the real total could be even higher. He described experimenting with poisons, silenced weapons, and improvised methods of execution. He explained how he froze victims, staged accidental death, and disposed of bodies so efficiently that most people were never even found. What disturbed viewers the most wasn't the violence itself. It was Richard's complete emotional detachment. He never raised his voice, never appeared proud or ashamed. He spoke about cyanide the way a mechanic might discuss a new tool. In one interview, when asked how he felt while killing, Richard responded flatly, "Nothing. I didn't feel anything. They meant nothing to me." Through these interviews, psychologists gained unprecedented insight into a mind capable of such controlled brutality. Unlike many serial killers, Richard lacked the chaotic compulsion to kill. He was methodical, practical, and businesslike. He didn't kill for pleasure or revenge alone. He killed because it was profitable, efficient, and, in his mind, necessary for survival. But even in prison, Richard remained unpredictable. In the early 2000s, he claimed that New York mob boss Carmen Genovese had once ordered him to kill Jimmy Hoffa, the infamous Teamsters leader whose disappearance remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. According to Richard, he executed Hoffa, placed his body in a steel drum, and shipped it to Japan for disposal. Investigators never confirmed the claim, but it added another layer to his legend. Despite his notoriety, Richard spent most of his prison years quietly at the Trenton State Prison in New Jersey. His health declined in the early 2000s as he battled heart disease and other complications. In March 2006, at the age of 70, Richard Kuklinski died of cardiac arrest. Just 6 months before he was scheduled to testify against a former Gambino associate. Some conspiracy theorists believe he was intentionally denied life-saving treatment in prison to silence him, though no conclusive evidence supports the theory. Richard's death marked the end of one of the most haunting chapters in American true crime history. For decades, he lived in plain sight, a man who could host family barbecues on Sunday and carry out a contract killing on Monday. His precision baffled investigators, his detachment unsettled psychologists, and his ability to live two lives simultaneously continues to fascinate criminologists to this day, even now. Years later, Richard's story remains a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how predators can hide in plain sight, how systemic corruption allows violence to flourish, and how the boundaries between family life and unimaginable darkness can blur without anyone noticing. But while Richard's reign of terror ended in the 1980s, another nightmare was already beginning to unfold on the opposite side of the country. In Los Angeles, 1984, a new kind of fear gripped the city. Families locked their doors and barricaded their windows. The summer heat hung heavy in the air, but people kept their lights off, afraid to draw attention. Mothers warned their children not to go outside after dark, and strangers no longer trusted each other. Whispers spread through neighborhoods about a figure who moved like a phantom, striking without warning and vanishing into the night. The newspapers would soon give him a name, the Night Stalker, while Richard Kuklinski operated in calculated silence, choosing his targets carefully and erasing every trace. This new predator thrived on chaos. He wanted the city terrified. He wanted the headlines. He wanted to leave symbols of evil behind, carved into the memory of Los Angeles forever. And his name was Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, later known as the Night Stalker, was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a struggling Mexican-American family. His early life was marked by instability, poverty, and a deep undercurrent of violence that shaped his personality long before Los Angeles would learn to fear his name. Even as a child, there was something unsettling about him, a quiet intensity behind his dark, watchful eyes, and a tendency to withdraw into silence while chaos unfolded around him. Richard's father, Julian Ramirez, had once been a hard-working laborer on the Santa Fe Railroad, but years of grueling labor and financial strain had left him bitter, angry, and volatile. At home, his temper erupted often and without warning. He disciplined his children harshly, using belts, fists, and words meant to break rather than teach. Richard's mother, Mercedes, worked at a boot factory, spending long hours on the production line and leaving the children largely to fend for themselves. While Mercedes tried to hold the family together, her soft-spoken nature was no match for Julian's unpredictable violence. From an early age, Richard experienced frequent epileptic seizures, a condition likely linked to head injuries he suffered as a child. The episodes frightened him and isolated him from other kids, creating an early sense of detachment from the world around him. His older siblings teased him, schoolmates mocked him, and his father offered little sympathy. While other children built friendships and social bonds, Richard retreated further into himself, spending long stretches alone and wandering the streets of El Paso at night. It was during these aimless nights that Richard found the person who would have the most profound and devastating influence on his life: his older cousin Miguel Mike Ramirez. Mike was a decorated U.S. Army Green Beret who had served in the Vietnam War, and to the young Richard, he was larger than life, charismatic, confident, and unafraid of anything. But beneath the heroic image, Mike carried something dark back from the jungles of Southeast Asia. Mike began showing Richard graphic Polaroids from his time in Vietnam. Photographs depicting torture, mutilation, and executions of Vietnamese women and prisoners. Richard, only 12 years old at the time, was captivated. While most children would have recoiled in horror, he stared silently at the images, absorbing them without reaction. Mike spoke about these acts casually, almost proudly, teaching Richard that violence wasn't something to fear or avoid, it was power. Worse still, Mike openly bragged about raping Vietnamese women during the war and showed Richard pictures of the assaults. He spoke of dominance and control, framing cruelty as a form of strength. For a boy already alienated from his peers, struggling with illness and abuse at home, Mike's influence was intoxicating. He made Richard believe that pain was normal, that empathy was weakness, and that survival meant becoming the predator, not the prey. Richard began spending nearly all his free time at Mike's house. Under Mike's influence, he started experimenting with drugs, marijuana, and LSD, and immersing himself in stories of war, violence, and death. While other boys his age were playing sports or going to school dances, Richard was learning how to stalk silently, how to handle weapons, and how to detach from the humanity of his targets. Mike, intentionally or not, was shaping Richard's worldview into something cold and predatory. Then, in 1973, when Richard was just 13, everything escalated. During an argument with his wife, Mike shot and killed her in front of Richard, blowing her head open with a revolver. Richard stood frozen, watching blood pool across the floor as Mike calmly sat down afterward, lit a cigarette, and waited for the police to arrive. For most teenagers, witnessing such an event would have been deeply traumatic. For Richard, it reinforced the lessons Mike had already been teaching him. Life was fragile, violence solved problems, and consequences could be avoided. Mike was arrested, but his lawyers argued post-traumatic stress disorder from his service in Vietnam. Incredibly, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state hospital, only to be released 4 years later. Richard took away a chilling message: even murder didn't necessarily mean punishment. After the incident, Richard withdrew further from his family and school. He began spending more time on the streets, drifting between friends' houses and sleeping in abandoned buildings. At school, his attendance plummeted, and his grades collapsed entirely. Teachers described him as distant, unresponsive, and unreachable, but few understood the depth of the darkness already taking root inside him. By his mid-teens, Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began breaking into homes, stealing electronics, and experimenting with risk. The rush of adrenaline from violating someone's private space gave him a sense of control he never had before. At the same time, his obsession with death and violence deepened. He became fascinated by true crime magazines, occult literature, and photographs of gruesome crime scenes. It was also during this period that Richard developed a growing interest in Satanism. While many of his peers flirted with counterculture movements for rebellion's sake, Richard seemed genuinely drawn to the philosophy of power and domination he found in occult writings. He saw Satan not as a figure of evil, but as a symbol of freedom from morality, guilt, and restraint. Later in life, this fascination would become a defining part of his identity, but the seeds were planted in these turbulent teenage years. By 1977, at the age of 17, Richard dropped out of high school entirely. He left El Paso and began drifting across Texas and eventually into California, working odd jobs and committing petty thefts to survive. It was in California that Richard began refining the skills he would later use as the Night Stalker, skills learned partly from Mike, partly from the streets, and partly from his growing desire for control over others. During this time, he became deeply entrenched in Los Angeles' dark underbelly, spending nights in Skid Row motels, pawn shops, and seedy bars. He experimented heavily with cocaine and LSD, further blurring the lines between reality and the violent fantasies growing in his mind. He became nocturnal, wandering the streets while others slept, scanning houses, memorizing routines, and studying vulnerabilities. He was learning, observing, and preparing, though even he may not have fully understood what he was preparing for. By now, Richard's worldview was fully formed. He no longer believed in morality or consequence, only in strength and survival. The abuse from his father, the violent lessons from Mike, the constant instability of his childhood, and the growing numbness from drug use combined to create someone uniquely detached from empathy. He didn't see people as human beings, he saw them as objects, as opportunities, as pieces in his personal game of control. Unbeknownst to anyone, the boy from El Paso who once stared silently at war photograph was on the brink of transforming into something far darker. He wasn't impulsive, at least not yet. He was patient, methodical, and increasingly fearless. While his crimes in these years were mostly petty thefts and burglaries, his fantasies had already escalated beyond simple survival. He wasn't just faking property anymore, he was imagining what it would feel like to take lives. By the end of the 1970s, Richard Ramirez had drifted fully into Los Angeles' shadows. He was broke, addicted, unstable, and living on society's fringes, but also invisible, blending seamlessly into a city overflowing with crime, homelessness, and noise. Los Angeles didn't notice him yet, but soon the city would know his name. And when Richard finally acted on the violent impulses that had been building for years, he wouldn't just commit murder. He would terrorize an entire metropolis, striking without pattern, without warning, and without mercy. Los Angeles was about to face a predator unlike anything it had ever seen before, a phantom who entered through unlocked windows, killed indiscriminately, and disappeared into the night. The summer of 1984 was approaching, and with it, the first signs of what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. The Night Stalker was awakening. By the late 1970s, Richard Ramirez had left El Paso behind, but the darkness that had been growing inside him for years followed him into California. Los Angeles in the late 70s was a city of contrasts, glitz and glamour on one side, poverty and violence on the other. Skid Row bustled with addicts, drifters, and lost souls. Entire neighborhoods were plagued by crime, yet only a few miles away stood pristine Hollywood mansions. For someone like Richard, who had always felt like an outsider, Los Angeles offered both anonymity and opportunity, the perfect environment for someone slowly sharpening himself into a predator. After dropping out of high school at 17, Richard drifted aimlessly, taking buses back and forth between Texas and California. He supported himself through petty thefts, burglaries, and occasional work at convenience stores and motels. He slept wherever he could, cheap hotels, park benches, friends' couches. His hygiene declined, his appearance became increasingly gaunt, and his already quiet personality hardened into an eerie stillness. To those who encountered him, he seemed strange but harmless, a soft-spoken young man, lanky and awkward, with long black hair falling into his face. Few would have guessed that beneath the surface, Richard was already preparing for something far darker. By this time, Richard's use of LSD, cocaine, and marijuana had escalated dramatically. The drugs blurred the line between reality and fantasy, deepening his dissociation from the world around him. Nights became his domain. He wandered Los Angeles streets long after midnight, studying houses, memorizing neighborhoods, and observing how easily people left their doors and windows unlocked. While others slept, Richard learned to move silently in the dark, blending with shadows, watching families through their windows without ever being seen. It was practice, though even he might not have fully realized it yet, a slow, obsessive preparation for the life he was about to embrace. It was during these years that Richard's fascination with Satanism intensified. He read extensively about occult rituals and power, visiting bookstores that specialized in dark, fringe literature. He collected symbols and fragments of ideology that he believed justified his growing desires. To Richard, Satan wasn't an abstract figure of evil. Satan was liberation, rebellion, and dominance. He began incorporating pentagrams into his notebooks and carving them into surfaces, internalizing the belief that morality was meaningless and that life and death were his to decide. Later, during his spree as the Night Stalker, this devotion would leave an unmistakable signature on his crimes. But before the killings began, Richard honed his craft through burglary. He broke into homes, slipping past locks and windows like a ghost, taking cash, jewelry, and electronics. For him, it wasn't just about the money, it was about power. The adrenaline rush of entering someone's private space, knowing they were unaware, gave him a sense of control he'd never experienced as a child under his father's abuse or, in the chaos of Mike's violent influence. In these early burglaries, he discovered the thrill of invisibility, the intoxicating realization that he could violate boundaries without consequence. During this time, Richard was arrested multiple times for theft and possession, but the justice system failed to recognize the escalating danger he posed. The charges were minor, the punishments minimal: fines, probation, short stints in county jail. Each release reinforced Richard's sense of invincibility. He was learning how to exploit the system's blind spots, perfecting the skills that would later allow him to terrorize Los Angeles without being caught for months. By 1983, Richard was fully immersed in Los Angeles's criminal underworld. He spent nights in seedy motels around Skid Row, where drugs and desperation were currency, and strangers came and went without questions. Here, Richard refined his methods, listening to stories from other criminals, trading stolen goods, and quietly collecting knowledge about weapons, locks, and surveillance systems. He developed a particular obsession with handguns, knives, and stealth tactics, spending hours practicing with weapons in isolated areas. It was also during this period that Richard's sexual sadism began to surface. Exposure to Mike's graphic war stories and violent pornography during his adolescence had already warped his understanding of intimacy and control. Now, fueled by drugs and detachment, Richard's fantasies escalated into darker territory. He wasn't satisfied simply with breaking into homes and stealing possessions. Increasingly, his thoughts were drawn toward the people inside, their fear, their vulnerability, their helplessness. This shift marked the true birth of the predator. Richard began choosing houses not just for valuables, but for opportunity, studying which families lived alone, which homes lacked dogs, which neighborhoods offered easy escape routes. He experimented with timing, moving silently, watching his targets before striking. He wasn't yet killing, but he was crossing invisible boundaries, becoming more daring, more confident, and more reckless with each intrusion. The pivotal moment came in April 1984, when Richard committed his first known murder. The victim was Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old woman living in Glassell Park. He entered her apartment through an unlocked window, intending at first to burglarize the home, but the encounter escalated violently. Jenny was found stabbed and nearly decapitated, her body showing signs of sexual assault. The brutality stunned detectives, but there were few leads, no witnesses, no fingerprints, and no apparent motive. For Richard, this killing unlocked something that burglary alone never provided: the ultimate sense of control over life and death. After that night, the barrier was gone. Richard's confidence grew, and his compulsions deepened. He realized how easily he could move unseen, how quickly he could vanish into the chaos of Los Angeles, and how powerless law enforcement seemed against someone willing to strike without pattern or restraint. Unlike many serial killers who develop a consistent signature, Richard thrived on unpredictability. He chose his targets randomly: men, women, children, the elderly, attacking in different neighborhoods, using different weapons, at different times of day. He wanted chaos. He wanted terror. By early 1985, the Los Angeles Police Department began to notice a disturbing pattern of violent home invasions spreading across the city. Victims were raped, tortured, beaten, and murdered, yet the methods varied wildly, making it nearly impossible to connect the crimes at first. Only later would detectives realize they were dealing with one man, a phantom who entered homes silently, inflicted unimaginable horror, and vanished before anyone could react. As the killings escalated, Richard embraced his identity fully. He stopped caring about secrecy and began leaving behind satanic symbols at some crime scenes, pentagrams scrawled on walls, ritualistic markings meant to terrify. During one attack, he forced a victim to swear loyalty to Satan, relishing the psychological power it gave him over his targets. The media would later amplify these details, transforming his spree into a citywide nightmare and fueling the legend of the Night Stalker. Behind the chaos, however, Richard was methodical in ways few understood. He studied police response times, memorized freeway exits, and avoided establishing any clear pattern detectives could exploit. He switched weapons constantly, using knives, guns, bludgeons, and even his bare hands. He stole cars, abandoned them miles away, and chose homes at random so investigators couldn't profile his movements. His unpredictability was his greatest weapon, making him appear unstoppable as fear spread like wildfire through Los Angeles. But even as his spree intensified, Richard's personal life spiraled further into decay. He was living almost entirely on junk food, cocaine, and adrenaline, his hygiene deteriorating to the point where acquaintances avoided him. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that both the police and rival criminals were hunting him. He rarely slept, preferring to roam the streets at night, scanning for new targets, blending into the darkness like a shadow no one could catch. By the spring of 1985, the city was paralyzed. People locked their doors and windows, bought extra locks and guard dogs, and avoided going outside after dark. The LAPD was under immense pressure from the public and the media to catch the man behind the wave of violence, but Richard seemed always one step ahead. Each time investigators thought they had found a lead, another brutal attack occurred miles away, dismantling their theories and deepening the panic. And unbeknownst to the city, Richard was just getting started. The summer of 1985 would mark the peak of his terror campaign. A string of attacks so brutal and unpredictable that Los Angeles would remember it for decades. The Night Stalker was no longer practicing, he was hunting, and soon his name would become synonymous with fear itself. By the spring of 1984, Los Angeles was already simmering with tension. The city was sprawling, chaotic, and deeply divided, pockets of wealth and safety sat beside neighborhoods riddled with poverty, drugs, and violence. Amidst this fragile balance, Richard Ramirez was preparing to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. His petty thefts, burglaries, and fantasies of domination had been escalating for years. He had practiced moving silently, slipping in and out of homes unnoticed, taking property and studying his victims without touching them. But in April 1984, everything changed. His first confirmed murder was Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old widow living in Glassell Park, a quiet working-class neighborhood in northeast Los Angeles. Jenny lived alone in a modest apartment close to her son, who often checked on her. On the night of June 28, 1984, Richard prowled the area, high on cocaine and restless, searching for an opportunity. The heat that night was oppressive, windows were open, doors were unlocked, and the city was vulnerable. At around 2:30 a.m., Richard noticed Jenny's apartment partially lit and approached cautiously. He slipped through an unlocked window, his movements silent, deliberate, practiced. Once inside, he quickly surveyed the small living space. Jenny was asleep in her bedroom. In later interviews, Richard admitted that he hadn't planned to kill her, at least not consciously. But when she awoke suddenly, startled by the noise, something inside him snapped. Jenny was attacked violently. Richard stabbed her repeatedly, the force of the strikes showing uncontrolled rage. Afterward, he sexually assaulted her, leaving behind a crime scene so brutal that responding detectives were shaken. Jenny's son, concerned after failing to reach her the next morning, discovered her body. The apartment was ransacked, but oddly not much was stolen. The act itself seemed less about robbery and more about release. For the LAPD, the Vinco case was disturbing but baffling. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no clear motive. Detectives concluded the killer had likely entered through the open window, but beyond that, they had little to work with. At the time, Los Angeles was dealing with an overwhelming number of violent crimes, and Jenny's murder became another unsolved case filed among hundreds. But for Richard, this night was transformative. In later confessions, Richard described the killing with eerie detachment. He said he experienced a rush, a sensation of ultimate control as he ended Jenny's life. He didn't express remorse. Instead, he spoke about curiosity, about finally knowing what it felt like to take a life and feeling more powerful than ever before. After the Vinco murder, Richard retreated briefly into the shadows. For months, he returned to burglaries, honing his techniques further and testing boundaries. But something inside him had changed permanently. Killing wasn't just a possibility anymore, it was an option, one he now knew he could take without consequence. The Vinco case went cold, and the absence of any follow-up from police only reinforced Richard's growing belief that he was untouchable. Throughout late 1984, Richard spent most nights prowling Los Angeles and the surrounding suburbs. He stayed in cheap motels, surviving on stolen money, drugs, and adrenaline. He mapped neighborhoods carefully, memorized escape routes, and learned how quickly police responded to different areas. He was methodical, but increasingly reckless, emboldened by his success. He also began experimenting with weapons, knives, handguns, hammers, testing what gave him the most control over his victims. Then, on March 17, 1985, he struck again. This time, the victim was Dale Okazaki, a 34-year-old woman living in Rosemead. Richard broke into her apartment while she and her roommate, Maria Hernandez, were returning home from dinner. He shot Maria in the face with a .22 caliber handgun, but the bullet ricocheted off her keys, miraculously sparing her life. Richard then entered the apartment and fatally shot Dale as she tried to hide behind a counter. Minutes later, the same night, Richard attacked again, this time targeting Scion Veronica Yu, a 30-year-old woman driving her car in Monterey Park. He pulled her from the vehicle, shot her twice, and fled. Two attacks within an hour signaled a frightening shift. Richard was no longer cautious or random. He was hunting, emboldened by chaos and intoxicated by the power he held over terrified strangers. By this point, detectives across Los Angeles began connecting the dots. Ballistics confirmed that the same gun had been used in both attacks, and the survival of Maria Hernandez provided investigators with their first description of the suspect, a tall, thin man with long dark hair, dressed in black, and wearing worn-out sneakers. It was the first time anyone had truly seen the face of the man who would soon become known as the Night Stalker. As the killings continued into the summer of 1985, Richard's methods became increasingly sadistic. He targeted homes at random, choosing neighborhoods in the San Gabriel Valley, Whittier, Arcadia, and Monterey Park. Victims were young and old, male and female, alone and with families. There was no pattern to his selection, making him unpredictable and nearly impossible to track. In some cases, he shot victims immediately upon entering. In others, he tortured them, demanding information about money and valuables before escalating into horrific violence. He often sexually assaulted women, sometimes in front of their partners, reveling in their fear and helplessness. In several instances, he forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan, scrawling pentagrams on walls and leaving behind symbols of his devotion to darkness. The press began reporting on the killings heavily by June 1985, coining the name the Night Stalker after a series of late-night home invasions linked to the same suspect. Panic spread across Los Angeles. Hardware stores sold out of locks, alarms, and guns. Families began sleeping together in single rooms, afraid of leaving windows open or doors unlocked. Meanwhile, Richard fed on the fear. He scoured newspapers and TV reports about his own crimes, studying the details investigators released. He relished the growing hysteria, knowing the city was holding its breath every night, terrified of the sound of footsteps outside their windows. One of the most chilling aspects of Richard's spree was his unpredictability. He didn't operate like most serial killers, who often stick to specific victim profiles or consistent patterns. Instead, he deliberately avoided predictability, making him harder to catch. He switched weapons constantly, sometimes using a .22 pistol, other times a knife, a hammer, or even bare hands. He traveled across vast distances between attacks, striking in different counties within days, then disappearing without a trace. By July 1985, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and LAPD had formed a joint task force dedicated to stopping the Night Stalker. Leading the investigation were detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, both veterans of homicide cases, but even they struggled against Richard's erratic methods. Without consistent patterns, investigators were left chasing fragments, shell casings, shoe prints, and survivor testimonies, none of which pointed to a clear suspect. What they didn't know was that Richard was learning from their mistakes just as fast as they were adapting to his. He constantly changed vehicles, swapped stolen license plates, and used stolen credit cards only once before discarding them. He had become a master of blending into Los Angeles's chaos, disappearing into crowds by day and emerging as a phantom by night. By the end of summer 1985, Richard Ramirez had committed over a dozen murders and left countless others traumatized by assaults and attempted killings. Yet despite mounting pressure from the media, terrified residents, and exhausted detectives, he was still free, still moving silently through the city, still watching. But Richard's growing confidence would eventually become his undoing. He began making mistakes, small ones at first, leaving traces he had once carefully avoided. Witnesses were beginning to remember his face. Survivors were describing his voice. Investigators were finally starting to see patterns in his chaos. The summer of terror had reached its peak, but the hunt for the Night Stalker was just beginning. And soon, Los Angeles would erupt into a fever pitch of fear, suspicion, and rage as the city mobilized to stop the man whose crimes seemed almost supernatural in their randomness and brutality. The summer of 1985 would forever change Los Angeles. By June, the murders and assaults linked to a mysterious prowler had escalated to a terrifying frequency. People whispered his name, the Night Stalker, though no one knew who he was or where he would strike next. There was no pattern to his crimes, no logic detectives could use to predict his movements. He chose rich neighborhoods and poor ones, young couples, and elderly widows, the quiet suburbs and the crowded streets alike. At night, as the city went silent under the oppressive summer heat, Los Angeles became a hunting ground. After the killing of Jenny Vinco and the double shooting of Dalo Kozaki and Veronica Yu, Richard Ramirez slipped deeper into his spree. On March 27, 1985, he entered the home of Vincent Zatzara, 64, and his wife Maxine, 44, in Whittier. Armed with a .22 caliber handgun, he shot Vincent in his sleep without warning. Maxine woke to find her husband dead and Richard standing over her. He tied her up, demanding to know where they kept valuables. When she refused, he brutally tortured her before killing her. Investigators later found a pentagram carved into her body. One of the first clear indications of the satanic elements Richard was incorporating into his crimes. The Zatzara murders sent shockwaves through the community. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, leading the task force, immediately recognized the similarity to previous attacks, but Richard's unpredictability made him almost impossible to track. He left so few clues, and when he did, they were either inconsistent or misleading. Still, one critical piece of evidence emerged, a partial footprint left outside the Zatzara's home. Investigators determined it came from an obvious sneaker, a relatively rare brand at the time. That footprint would later become a vital thread connecting multiple crime scenes. By early summer, Richard's attacks became bolder and more frequent. On May 14th, he entered the home of Bill Doy, 66, and his disabled wife Lillian, 56, in Monterey Park. He shot Bill in the face, assaulted Lillian, and ransacked their home for valuables. Despite his injuries, Bill managed to call 911, but he died before paramedics arrived. Once again, the shell casings matched previous crime scenes, tying this attack to what was quickly becoming an expanding trail of carnage. The randomness of the attacks terrified Los Angeles residents. Unlike other serial killers, Richard didn't fit a profile. He targeted the elderly and young, men and women, single-family homes and apartments alike. Some victims were asleep, others were awake, and some were ambushed as they walked through their front doors. His unpredictability made him especially dangerous because there was no safe demographic, no area that felt untouchable. On May 29th, Richard struck again, entering the Monrovia home of Mabel Mobel, 83, and her sister Florence Nettie Lang, 81. He attacked both women with a hammer, electrocuted them with an extension cord, and drew pentagrams on their thighs and walls. Florence survived the assault, but Mabel died from her injuries. Detectives were horrified by the brutality and the increasingly ritualistic nature of the crimes. Richard wasn't just killing, he was terrorizing, leaving symbols meant to amplify fear, mocking both his victims and the police who couldn't stop him. By now, media coverage exploded. Local television stations ran nightly updates about the Night Stalker, warning residents to lock their doors, secure their windows, and arm themselves. Gun sales surged. Hardware stores ran out of locks, and families began sleeping in shifts to ensure someone stayed awake through the night. Some neighborhoods even organized watch groups, patrolling their streets armed with bats, flashlights, and radios. But Richard seemed to thrive on the panic. He began intentionally leaving behind satanic markings, carving pentagrams on walls, and demanding victims swear to Satan during attacks. He wasn't just committing murders anymore, he was building a mythology around himself, cultivating fear like a weapon. His obsession with Satanism wasn't new, but now it became central to his identity. Survivors later recalled how he would chant phrases in a low, unsettling voice, declaring that Satan would protect him and that God couldn't save his victims. On June 27th, Richard invaded the Arcadia home of Patty Higgins, 32, a kindergarten teacher. He strangled her and left her body to be discovered by colleagues days later. Then, just 2 days later, on June 29th, he broke into the home of Mary Louise Cannon, 75, in Arcadia. He bludgeoned and stabbed her before fleeing the scene. Investigators noted that his attacks were becoming more frequent, less controlled, and increasingly sadistic. Throughout July, Richard moved at an alarming pace. On July 2nd, he attacked Mary Molly Keller, 63, and her husband Edward, 66, in Arcadia. Edward was shot in the head and killed instantly, while Molly was beaten and sexually assaulted before Richard fled. By mid-July, Los Angeles was in a state of near panic, and the city's police departments, LAPD, the sheriff's department, and local agencies began coordinating more closely than ever before to track him down. Detectives Salerno and Curlo pushed relentlessly, examining hundreds of leads, conducting neighborhood sweeps, and piecing together evidence from dozens of crime scenes. The obvious sneaker print became one of their strongest links, matching at least 7 separate attacks. But despite the growing mountain of evidence, Richard remained elusive. He moved constantly, using stolen vehicles and public transportation to strike neighborhoods miles apart on consecutive nights. By July 20th, Richard committed one of his most infamous attacks. He entered the home of Leland Niding, 66, and her husband Maxon, 68, in Glendale. He shot Maxon instantly, then tied up Leela, torturing her for information about valuables before killing her. This time, he left behind a distinct bloody obvious shoe print, a silent message to investigators who had been chasing his trail. By now, whispers of the Night Stalker dominated Los Angeles. Radio hosts, television anchors, and newspapers repeated his nickname gaily, and residents obsessed over every new detail. As the city's fear grew, Richard's confidence deepened. He seemed to feed off the attention, savoring the chaos he created. Unlike most killers who avoided publicity, Richard embraced it, almost daring the police to catch him. The tipping point came in August 1985, when Richard escalated his attacks further, now venturing beyond Los Angeles into nearby counties. On August 6th, he murdered Christopher Peterson, 38, and seriously wounded his wife, Virginia, in Northridge. 2 days later, on August 8th, he struck the Diamond Bar home of Peter Pan, 66, and his wife Barbara, 62, shooting Peter and sexually assaulting Barbara before fleeing with valuables. At each crime scene, the same details repeated: no forced entry, random targets, satanic symbols, and the same rare obvious shoe print. Finally, detectives had enough to connect multiple murders definitively. They publicly announced that Los Angeles was being stalked by a single serial killer, the Night Stalker, sparking one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. But as the investigation intensified, Richard grew bolder. On August 18th, he attacked the home of Elias Aboth, 35, and his wife Sakina, 27, in Mission Viejo. After shooting Elias and assaulting Sakina, he demanded she swear loyalty to Satan before leaving her alive. This time, neighbors noticed a suspicious car and recorded its license plate, giving detectives their first major breakthrough. The vehicle, a stolen Toyota, was quickly recovered, and investigators lifted a single fingerprint from the rearview mirror. That fingerprint changed everything. For the first time, detectives had a name: Richard Ramirez. When they matched the print to his criminal record for burglary and drug possession, they also obtained a mugshot. On August 30th, 1985, the LAPD held a press conference, releasing his photo to the public. Across Los Angeles, his face appeared on newspapers, television, and posters within hours. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was no longer a phantom. But Richard didn't know yet that his anonymity was gone. As he wandered the streets of East Los Angeles, residents were already on high alert. People taped his photo to storefront windows, whispered his name in fear, and carried weapons, ready to defend themselves. For the first time, the hunter was being hunted, and the city was preparing for a confrontation unlike anything Los Angeles had seen before. The summer of terror was reaching its breaking point. Richard had built a reign of chaos, but his desire for power and attention had finally betrayed him. The city that once lived in fear was about to rise against the Night Stalker. And when it did, Richard Ramirez would discover that terror, once unleashed, has a way of coming full circle. By the end of August 1985, Los Angeles was no longer just a city, it was a fortress. People who had once left their doors unlocked now secured them with deadbolts, iron bars, and alarm systems. Hardware stores were emptied of locks and motion detectors. Gun shops were selling out of handguns, rifles, and ammunition at record speed. Families slept in shifts, keeping one person awake at all times, while others huddled together in single rooms. The fear was total, relentless, and consuming. The name the Night Stalker was whispered in schools, shouted on radio stations, and blared across televisions. No one felt safe, not in their homes, not in their cars, not even in daylight. When the LAPD released Richard Ramirez's mugshot on August 30th, 1985, it was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. For months, the Night Stalker had been an invisible phantom, a faceless terror striking seemingly at random. Now Los Angeles had a face pale, gaunt, with dark, sunken eyes and tangled hair that framed a chillingly blank expression. Within hours, his photo was plastered on television screens, newspapers, storefronts, and bulletin boards across Southern California. The public finally knew who they were hunting. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department, detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, the men leading the investigation, understood that this was the critical turning point. Until now, Richard had controlled the narrative, attacking where and when he pleased, vanishing into the chaos of a city too sprawling to contain him. But now, for the first time, the advantage shifted. The public's awareness meant he could no longer move unnoticed. Meanwhile, Richard was unaware that his anonymity had been shattered. On August 30th, the day after his identity became public, he returned to Los Angeles from a trip to Arizona, having visited relatives there. He arrived at the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown LA expecting to slip quietly back into the city's shadows. But this time, everything was different. As Richard walked past a group of passengers clustered around a newspaper stand, he noticed something strange, his own face staring back at him from the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Witnesses later described the moment his expression shifted, the realization dawning on him instantly. Richard was no longer the hunter, he was the prey. Without saying a word, he backed away from the crowd and hurried out of the terminal, disappearing into the streets of East Los Angeles. But what he didn't know was that the city had already mobilized. People recognized his face. Strangers whispered, glanced, and followed him. In neighborhoods that had lived in fear for months, residents now carried baseball bats, knives, and guns, ready to defend themselves if the Night Stalker came near. The LAPD, meanwhile, was coordinating one of the largest manhunts in California's history. Hundreds of officers from multiple departments, LAPD, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and the California Highway Patrol, were working around the clock. Helicopters circled neighborhoods, checkpoints were set up on highways, and calls flooded into hotlines from residents who believed they had spotted Ramirez. For the first time in months, there was a sense of control returning to law enforcement. But the pressure was immense. The media's constant coverage had turned the investigation into a spectacle. News vans crowded outside police stations, reporters hounded detectives for updates, and TV anchors counted the days Ramirez had been on the run since being identified. While the publicity helped alert the public, it also created challenges. Every false sighting, every rumor, and every mistaken identity pulled valuable resources away from the real search. Despite this, Detectives Salerno and Carrillo used the chaos to their advantage. They carefully monitored Ramirez's known habits, his drug use, his preference for seedy motels, his comfort in low-income neighborhoods where police presence was minimal. Based on his patterns, they predicted that Richard would eventually return to familiar areas of East Los Angeles, Skid Row, and the surrounding communities. They were right. On the morning of August 31, 1985, Richard was spotted in Boyle Heights, an East LA neighborhood. He tried to purchase a bus ticket but quickly realized people were staring. Whispers spread rapidly. "That's the Night Stalker," someone called the police, but before officers could arrive, Richard fled on foot. As he moved deeper into residential streets, his panic became obvious. The predator who once prowled Los Angeles silently was now disoriented, cornered, and desperate. Residents began recognizing him almost immediately. In East Los Angeles, where fear of the Night Stalker had been most intense, people acted fast. A local mechanic, Manuel de la Torre, later recalled spotting Ramirez and shouting his name aloud. Within minutes, dozens of neighbors joined in, chasing him through alleys and side streets. Richard tried to steal a car to escape, but failed, drawing more attention as he struggled with the driver. The crowd grew larger, angrier, and louder, determined not to let him slip away. Finally, near the intersection of Hubbard Street and East Cesar Chavez Avenue, a group of residents cornered him. Armed with metal pipes, wooden planks, and whatever they could find, they subdued him violently, striking him repeatedly while shouting curses in Spanish and English. Ramirez, dazed and bleeding, screamed at the crowd to let him go, but no one listened. They had waited months for this moment, and the fear that had gripped their community had transformed into fury. When LAPD officers arrived minutes later, they found Ramirez beaten, handcuffed with belts, and pinned to the ground by several men. The mob refused to release him at first, shouting at police to take him away before they finished the job themselves. Detectives Salerno and Carrillo arrived shortly after, stunned by the scene. The man who had terrorized an entire city was captured not by police, but by the people he had hunted. As Richard was placed in the back of a police car, his expression was vacant, almost detached. Witnesses recall him whispering something under his breath, though accounts vary. Some claim he said, "It's over," while others believe he muttered a prayer to Satan. Either way, the reign of the Night Stalker had come to an end. Within hours, news of his capture exploded across Los Angeles. Crowds gathered outside police stations, chanting in celebration. Television broadcasts replayed images of his mugshot alongside scenes of residents embracing, crying, and holding up newspapers declaring, "Night Stalker caught," after months of living under siege. The city could finally breathe again. But for Detectives Salerno and Carrillo, the work was far from over. Capturing Ramirez was only the beginning. Now came the monumental task of proving his guilt in court. Over 70 crime scenes were connected to his spree spanning multiple counties, with dozens of murders, sexual assaults, and burglaries attributed to him. The evidence had to be meticulously gathered, catalogued, and presented, all while the public watched anxiously, demanding justice. In the weeks following his arrest, investigators searched the small apartment Ramirez had been using as his base of operations. Inside, they found stolen jewelry, weapons, and satanic materials, including drawings of pentagrams and occult symbols. His sneakers, the rare obvious shoes, matched perfectly with the footprint impressions collected at multiple crime scenes. Combined with ballistic tests, eyewitness testimony, and forensic evidence, the case against him grew stronger by the day. Still, Ramirez showed no remorse. During early interrogations, he remained calm, often smirking as detectives described the evidence piling up against him. When asked why he committed the murders, he offered little explanation beyond cryptic references to Satan and fate. "No big deal," he once said during questioning. "Death always comes." Despite the relief in Los Angeles, the fear he left behind lingered. People still double-checked their locks at night, still slept with lights on, and still flinched at unexpected noises. Richard Ramirez had been captured, but the trauma he inflicted on the city remained etched into its collective memory. The trial that followed would become one of the most sensational in California's history, exposing the darkest corners of Ramirez's mind and the horrifying details of his crimes. It would last years, with testimony from survivors, detectives, and forensic experts painting a complete picture of the chaos he unleashed on Los Angeles. But before the world could understand the depth of his depravity, Los Angeles needed to come to terms with something else. The reign of the Night Stalker was over, but the scars of his terror would never fully heal. And as the cameras turned toward the courtroom, the man who once thrived in darkness was about to face the brightest spotlight of his life, one from which there would be no escape. When investigators began piecing together the chaotic trail of Richard Ramirez's attacks, one of the most disturbing revelations wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the meaning behind them. At first, detectives struggled to understand why he killed the way he did, the randomness of his targets, the unpredictability of his methods, and the strange symbols he sometimes left behind. But as they dug deeper, a dark pattern emerged, one that tied many of his assaults and murders together. Richard Ramirez wasn't just committing crimes for pleasure or profit. He was building a mythology, one rooted in his growing obsession with Satanism. From his teenage years in El Paso, Richard had already been fascinated by the occult. His cousin Mike's influence exposed him to extreme violence early on, but it was during his years drifting through California that Richard fully immersed himself in satanic ideology. He consumed books on black magic, ritualistic sacrifice, and demonic symbolism, seeking meaning in the darkness he already carried within himself. While many turned to religion for redemption, Richard rejected traditional morality entirely. For him, Satan wasn't a figure of fear or damnation. Satan was power, rebellion, and freedom. Detectives later uncovered drawings of inverted pentagrams in Richard's belongings, along with notebooks filled with fragmented phrases referencing infernal protection and eternal freedom. But perhaps most chilling was the evidence left behind at his crime scenes. At several homes, survivors reported seeing Richard carve pentagrams into walls, furniture, and even bodies. During one particularly brutal attack, he forced a victim to swear allegiance to Satan at gunpoint before sparing her life, as though offering her a chance at salvation through submission. For Richard, this wasn't just theatrics, it was ritual. In later interviews, Ramirez described Satan not as an abstract concept but as an ever-present force guiding his actions. He believed the murders brought him closer to something greater than himself, that each life he took deepened his connection to the power he worshipped. This belief emboldened him. He became convinced he was protected, that police couldn't stop him, that death couldn't touch him, that his spree was part of something cosmic and inevitable. For Detectives Salerno and Carrillo, Richard's satanic fixation became both a coup and a complication. On one hand, the symbols he left behind helped connect crime scenes that otherwise seemed unrelated, pentagrams scrawled in lipstick, drawn in dust, or etched crudely into walls. On the other hand, the erratic nature of these markings made it harder to predict his next move. Unlike other killers who followed rigid patterns, Richard's allegiance to Satan seemed to justify constant chaos. He could kill with a gun one night, a knife the next, or bare hands the night after, all in service to the same dark devotion. This element of ritualistic violence added a layer of terror to an already panicked city. The public's fear, already heightened by the Night Stalker's random attacks, deepened when news outlets began reporting on the satanic symbols left at scenes. Talk radio hosts speculated about satanic cults operating in Los Angeles, and religious leaders preached sermons warning about evil forces lurking among them. Some communities began organizing prayer groups in addition to neighborhood watches, believing faith was the only defense against something so sinister. During his spree, Richard often invoked Satan verbally. Survivors testified that he muttered incantations in a low, guttural voice, speaking phrases they couldn't understand but described as otherworldly. In one case, a victim recounted how Richard placed his hand on her chest and said, "Satan will save me," before striking her. In another, he left a bloody pentagram drawn on a bedroom wall alongside the words "Hail Satan." These moments weren't accidents. They were deliberate psychological warfare, designed to amplify the terror he created and to establish himself as something more than human in the minds of his victims. Yet, beneath the theatrics, Richard's satanic fixation was deeply personal. In conversations after his arrest, he spoke of feeling rejected by society, by his family, and by the concept of God itself. To Richard, worshipping Satan was an act of defiance, a way of taking control in a life where he had long felt powerless. As a child, he was beaten, mocked, and belittled. As an adult, he found belonging in darkness. Where others found morality in religion, he found liberation in its rejection. This self-styled identity, as an agent of Satan, influenced every aspect of his spree. He often wore all black when prowling neighborhoods at night, his long dark hair framing his face like a shadow. Witnesses recalled seeing him dressed like a phantom, blending into the darkness, his sneakers silent against the pavement. The rare obvious sneakers, which detectives traced to at least 7 separate crime scenes, became an unintentional calling card, not because Richard wanted to be caught, but because deep down he believed he couldn't be. After Richard's capture, the satanic aspects of his crimes became central to the prosecution's case. Prosecutors argued that his fixation on Satan wasn't just a personal belief, it was the motive behind the random brutality, the glue connecting otherwise unlinked crimes into a single spree of terror. They highlighted his rituals, his symbolic markings, and his verbal invocations, painting a portrait of a man who believed himself untouchable because he thought he served a higher, darker power. The trial opened in July 1988, 3 years after his arrest, and the satanic imagery quickly dominated headlines. Ramirez arrived in court dressed in black, smirking at reporters, and flashing a pentagram drawn on his hand while shouting "Hail Satan" at photographers. It was a moment designed for spectacle, a calculated performance that cemented his identity in the public's imagination. For many, this was the first time they saw the man behind the legend, not a phantom in the shadows, but a gaunt, pale figure feeding on attention, enjoying the chaos he'd created. Inside the courtroom, survivors recounted chilling testimonies. One woman described how Ramirez forced her to kneel and pray to Satan before he assaulted her. Another recounted hearing him chant unintelligible phrases, as he drew pentagrams on her bedroom walls. The evidence, physical, verbal, and symbolic, was overwhelming. Between eyewitness accounts, matching shoe prints, ballistics, stolen items found in his possession, and his own self-incriminating statements, prosecutors built a devastating case. But Richard seemed almost energized by the attention. He laughed during testimony, stared coldly at witnesses, and showed no remorse. Courtroom observers noted his eerie calmness, as though he existed in a reality separate from everyone else. While most defendants avoid the spotlight, Ramirez embraced it, understanding that his persona as a servant of Satan amplified his power, even from behind bars. Religious groups flooded the courthouse steps daily, holding crosses and chanting prayers. Television cameras captured the clashes between demonstrators and Ramirez supporters, a small but vocal group fascinated by his darkness, some even calling him a misunderstood prophet. These bizarre displays turned the trial into a cultural spectacle, blurring the line between crime reporting and sensationalism. Despite his theatrics, the outcome was inevitable. On September 20, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The jury deliberated less than 4 days before recommending the death penalty. When the verdict was read, Ramirez smiled faintly and whispered into a microphone, "Big deal. Death always comes." It was the same chilling detachment he had shown from the moment of his arrest. The judge, addressing Ramirez directly during sentencing, called him a malignant evil and said he showed no regard for human life. Richard listened silently, his dark, hollow eyes betraying no reaction. Yet before being led away, he turned to reporters and offered one final statement. "You don't understand me. You never will." Hail Satan! The satanic symbolism that had haunted his victims, investigators, and the public became inseparable from his legacy. Richard Ramirez wanted to be remembered not just as a killer, but as something larger, a figure of fear, rebellion, and chaos. In that sense, he succeeded. Even decades later, his crimes stand out not only for their brutality, but for the psychological warfare he waged on an entire city. Behind bars, Richard continued receiving fan mail, often from admirers fascinated by his dark aura and unrepentant persona. He responded occasionally, maintaining his satanic image. But over the years his notoriety faded into the background as California's death row population grew. Still, those who remembered the summer of 1985 never forgot the terror of waking to sirens, headlines, and whispers about a man who struck at random, demanding victims pray to a god of chaos. Richard's satanic signature wasn't just carved into walls or spoken in the dead of night. It was etched into the collective memory of Los Angeles, a reminder that fear itself can be weaponized, amplified, and made immortal. By late August 1985, Los Angeles was a city teetering on the edge of panic and exhaustion. For months, the Night Stalker had terrorized entire neighborhoods, striking without pattern or logic, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable brutality. Families locked themselves inside fortified homes, sleeping in groups with baseball bats and loaded guns at the ready. Churches were overflowing with worshippers praying for protection. Television anchors opened every nightly broadcast with his name, and newspapers published every gruesome detail investigators would release. The collective paranoia had transformed Los Angeles into a city under siege. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department, detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Perillo were working around the clock. Their small team had become the heart of one of the largest manhunts in California's history. Each new crime scene meant more pressure, more sleepless nights, and more desperate leads to chase. For months, Richard Ramirez had danced just beyond their reach, taunting them with his unpredictability. But as August drew to a close, the tides were shifting. After weeks of painstaking investigation, forensic analysis, and coordination between departments, Salerno and Carrillo were closer than ever to uncovering his identity. The breakthrough came from the Mission Viejo attack on August 24, 1985. That night, Richard entered the home of Elias and Sakina Bawith, shooting Elias dead instantly and assaulting Sakina while forcing her to swear allegiance to Satan. But this time, Richard made two critical mistakes. First, neighbors spotted a suspicious orange Toyota station wagon parked near the home and managed to take down the license plate number. Second, while escaping, Richard left a clear fingerprint on the vehicle's rearview mirror. Investigators traced the car and confirmed it had been stolen days earlier, but the fingerprint was the real key. They rushed it to the crime lab, where technicians meticulously compared it against thousands of prints in California's criminal database. Hours later, the match came back. Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a long history of burglary, drug possession, and petty crime. Suddenly, the phantom had a name, a face, and a history, and the hunt entered a new phase. Salerno and Carrillo wasted no time. Within hours, they gathered Richard's mugshot from a 1984 arrest and circulated it among task force members. At the same time, they discovered his criminal file contained several critical details: his known hangouts in East Los Angeles, his previous arrests, and his last known addresses. It became clear that Richard wasn't some mastermind with an elaborate network protecting him. He was reckless, transient, and impulsive, traits that had allowed him to evade capture but would ultimately lead to his downfall. On August 30, 1985, the LAPD made a bold move. They released Richard's name and photo to the public. Some within the department worried this would drive him underground, but Salerno argued the opposite. By exposing his face, they would turn the entire city into their ally. If Richard tried to hide in Los Angeles, millions of eyes would be watching. The strategy worked better than anyone imagined. Overnight, Richard Ramirez went from an invisible terror to the most recognized man in Southern California. Newspapers plastered his photo on their front pages with headlines like "Night Stalker Identified" and "Hunt on for Ramirez." Television broadcasts replayed his mugshot in constant loops. Flyers with his face were taped to storefronts, telephone poles, and gas stations. Within hours, thousands of calls began flooding police hotlines from people who believed they had seen him. What investigators didn't know was that Richard was already on the move. On the morning of August 31st, he returned to Los Angeles after visiting his brother in Arizona. Completely unaware that his identity had been made public the day before, he stepped off a Greyhound bus at the downtown terminal, expecting to vanish back into the chaos of the city as he always had. But something was different. Richard walked into a convenience store and noticed a group of people clustered around newspapers, whispering urgently. Curious, he stepped closer and froze. His own face stared back at him from the front page. Witnesses later recalled the moment vividly. Richard's body stiffened, his eyes widened, and without a word, he turned and bolted out the door. From that moment on, the hunter became the hunted. Richard fled into East Los Angeles, desperately trying to find transportation, but the city was no longer on his side. People recognized him almost instantly. Residents shouted warnings, called the police, and began following him through the streets. At one point, he attempted to carjack a vehicle but was fought off by the driver, drawing even more attention. Word spread quickly. In the tight-knit neighborhoods of Boyle Heights and East L.A., where fear of the Night Stalker had been most palpable, residents mobilized. Dozens of people began trailing Richard, shouting for others to join. Within minutes, a full-scale chase erupted. Streets filled with angry residents armed with pipes, wooden planks, and makeshift weapons. Richard sprinted through alleyways, vaulting over fences, searching desperately for an escape, but the net was tightening around him. Finally, near the intersection of East Hubbard Street and East Cesar Chavez Avenue, Richard was surrounded. Panting, sweaty, and disoriented, he tried to fight, grabbing a metal bar from the ground, but the crowd overwhelmed him. They struck him repeatedly, knocking him to the pavement. One man later said, "He looked at us like he couldn't believe it, like he finally understood he wasn't in control anymore." By the time LAPD officers arrived, Richard was bleeding, battered, and pinned to the ground by several men. Officers quickly took him into custody, placing him in the back of a patrol car as the crowd cheered and shouted in relief. Some residents chanted, "El Matador! El Matador, the killer!" The killer. For months, Richard Ramirez had terrorized their homes and families. Now they had been the ones to bring him down. Inside the LAPD headquarters that evening, Detectives Salerno and Carrillo watched as Ramirez was processed. For months, they had hunted a phantom, a figure who seemed to move through walls, leaving chaos in his wake. Now he sat quietly in an interrogation room, his dark hair matted with sweat and blood, his gaunt face expressionless. It was almost anticlimactic, given the scale of the terror he had inflicted. During questioning, Richard spoke little, occasionally smirking but refusing to cooperate. He gave no indication of remorse, no explanations for his actions, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he simply stared back in silence. But for Salerno, Carrillo, and the city of Los Angeles, the nightmare was over. The man who had seemed untouchable was now behind bars. It was the culmination of months of grueling work, sleepless nights, and relentless pursuit. For the first time in nearly a year, Los Angeles could breathe again. Still, the investigation was far from finished. Detectives now faced the monumental task of linking Richard to dozens of murders, assaults, and burglaries across Southern California. The evidence, the obvious sneaker print, ballistic matches, fingerprints, stolen property, and survivor testimonies, painted a damning picture. Each new connection strengthened the case, but the legal battle would be long and intense. And while Los Angeles celebrated his capture, a darker realization settled in. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a criminal. He was something far more unsettling, a man driven by chaos, by domination, and by a belief that his violence served a higher, unholy power. For months, he had played a game of cat and mouse with millions of people, feeding off their fear like fuel. But in the end, it was his arrogance, his belief in his own invincibility, that brought him down. The hunt for the Night Stalker was over, but the story was far from finished. Ahead lay one of the longest, most sensational trials in California's history, a case that would expose the darkest corners of Richard's mind and the horrifying details of his crimes. Survivors would testify. Families would face their grief. And the man who once whispered, "Hail Satan," in the dead of night would face judgment in the light of day. The city had waited for this moment for months. But justice, like fear, would come slowly. When Richard Ramirez was finally dragged into custody on August 31, 1985, the city of Los Angeles seemed to exhale for the first time in months. The predator, who had haunted their nights, who had terrorized families, and turned bedrooms into battlefields, was now locked in the back of a police car, bruised, bloodied, and silent. Crowds of residents who had chased him through the streets stood on sidewalks, cheering and shouting as the man who had held the city hostage was finally taken away. For the first time in nearly a year, there was a fragile sense of relief. But for detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, the work had only just begun. Catching Richard Ramirez was only the start. To secure a conviction, they needed to connect him definitively to a sprawling trail of crimes that spanned multiple counties, dozens of crime scenes, and a horrifying variety of assaults, murders, and burglaries. Despite the celebration in Los Angeles, they knew this would become one of the most complex and high-profile trials in California's history. Inside LAPD headquarters that night, Richard sat quietly in an interrogation room. His long, dark hair hung over his gaunt face, partially hiding the bruises from the beating he received during his capture. His hands were cuffed tightly, his expression unreadable. When detectives began questioning him, they were met with silence. Occasionally, he would smirk or mutter short phrases, but he gave no coherent statements and offered no explanations for his actions. In the following days, prosecutors began assembling their case. Investigators meticulously cataloged the evidence collected from dozens of crime scenes. The rare obvious sneaker print matched perfectly to Ramirez's shoes. Ballistic tests connected his .22 caliber weapon to multiple murders. Fingerprints placed him inside homes, and jewelry stolen from victims was found in his possession. On top of that, survivor testimonies began pouring in, each describing the same terrifying figure, a tall, gaunt man with long, tangled hair, decaying teeth, and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through them. Despite this mountain of evidence, Ramirez acted as though none of it mattered. During preliminary hearings, he maintained a chilling composure, sitting slouched in his chair, rarely making eye contact with prosecutors or victims' families. But when the cameras turned on, his demeanor shifted. He would lift his hand to reveal a crude pentagram drawn across his palm and shout, "Hail Satan," at reporters. It was clear that Ramirez understood the spectacle surrounding his case and had chosen to lean into it, transforming himself from a faceless predator into a figure designed to terrify even from behind bars. As prosecutors prepared for trial, Ramirez's defense team struggled to build a coherent strategy. They attempted to cast doubt on the forensics, arguing that evidence had been mishandled and witnesses were unreliable due to media influence. They even explored an insanity defense, claiming Richard's obsession with Satanism and violence pointed to severe psychological disturbance. But the prosecution was ready for these arguments, presenting a meticulously constructed case built on overwhelming forensic consistency, survivor testimony, and Ramirez's own words recorded after his arrest. The trial officially began on July 22, 1988, nearly 3 years after his capture. The delay had been caused by extensive pretrial motions, changes in defense counsel, and the sheer complexity of the case. More than 70 charges spanning 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers eager to witness the proceedings. Television cameras captured every moment, turning the trial into one of the most widely covered events of the decade. From the beginning, the courtroom was a stage and Richard Ramirez was its unwilling but captivating star. He entered the room each day dressed in dark clothing, his long black hair framing his angular face. Sometimes he smiled faintly at the cameras, other times he sat motionless, staring blankly at the floor as if nothing happening around him concerned him. He seemed detached from reality, yet whenever reporters mentioned his name, he came alive, occasionally baring his yellowed teeth in a smirk that unsettled even seasoned journalists. Witness after witness took the stand, describing nights of unimaginable terror. Survivors spoke through tears, recounting how Ramirez broke into their homes, beat them, and demanded they swear to Satan before sparing their lives. Others described watching their loved ones killed in front of them. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, visibly disturbed by the details they were forced to relive day after day. The satanic imagery became one of the trial's defining elements. Prosecutors introduced photographs of pentagrams scrawled on walls and furniture, symbols carved into victim skin, and evidence of occult materials recovered from Ramirez's belongings. They argued that his obsession with Satan was not only central to understanding his motives, but also proof of his deliberate cruelty and calculated psychological warfare. Ramirez seemed to relish these moments. At one point, during a recess, he turned to the gallery, raised his hand to show his palm, and whispered, "Evil has always existed. It's here in all of us." On another day, he laughed quietly as prosecutors described the brutality of his crimes, further cementing his image as unrepentant and detached from human morality. Outside the courtroom, the spectacle intensified. Crowds gathered daily, holding signs demanding justice and chanting prayers. Some brought crosses and Bibles, convinced Ramirez was a vessel of demonic influence. But in a strange and unsettling twist, Ramirez also attracted a following. Young women dressed in black and wearing pentagram necklaces began appearing outside the courthouse, declaring their admiration for him. Some even sent love letters to his cell. To them, Ramirez embodied rebellion, danger, and the ultimate rejection of authority. The media fed this frenzy relentlessly. Headlines screamed his nickname daily, amplifying every outburst, every smirk, every whispered phrase. Television talk shows debated his mental state, newspapers printed speculative analyses of his childhood and psychology, and late-night radio hosts dissected his fascination with Satanism. Ramirez had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of something darker, a cultural icon of fear and fascination. Despite the chaos surrounding the case, the prosecution's strategy remained steady and methodical. They presented physical evidence first, the matching footprints, ballistics, and fingerprints, leaving no doubt that Ramirez had been at the scenes of multiple murders. Then came the survivor testimonies, raw and emotional, describing a man who seemed to thrive on unpredictability, alternating between casual conversation and sudden explosions of violence. Finally, prosecutors leaned into Ramirez's own statements, highlighting moments where he boasted about his connection to Satan and mocked law enforcement for failing to catch him sooner. By the time closing arguments began in September 1989, the jury had endured months of horrifying testimony and relentless imagery. The prosecution painted Ramirez as a man fully aware of his actions, driven by lust, cruelty, and a desire for power. The defense, lacking any viable alternative narrative, struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. On September 20, 1989, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 43 separate counts, including 13 murders. The courtroom erupted. Victims' families wept openly, reporters scrambled to send out breaking updates, and Ramirez sat silently, his face blank. When asked if he had anything to say, he leaned toward the microphone and, with a faint smile, whispered, "Big deal." Death always comes. The sentencing phase followed swiftly. On November 7, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death by gas chamber. As the judge read the sentence, Ramirez showed no visible reaction. Before being let out, he addressed the courtroom one last time, saying, "You don't understand me. You never will. You are not capable. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. Hail Satan." With that, Richard Ramirez was escorted to San Quentin State Prison, where he would join California's death row. Even behind bars, his notoriety persisted. He received hundreds of letters from admirers, continued drawing satanic symbols, and gave occasional interviews in which he maintained his calm but detached demeanor. To him, the trial had only amplified the image he wanted to project, a figure untethered by morality, feared and remembered. For Los Angeles, however, the trial marked closure. The city that had endured months of terror could finally begin to heal. Locks came off windows. Families returned to routines, and the collective tension that had gripped the region slowly began to dissolve. Yet the scars remained. For many, the summer of 1985 was unforgettable, A time when fear ruled every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the night. But Richard Ramirez's story wasn't over yet. The trial may have sentenced him to death, but his name would linger for decades, whispered in true crime documentaries, studied by psychologists, and feared by anyone who remembered waking up to headlines about the Night Stalker. And while he sat in his cell at San Quentin, waiting for an execution date that would take decades to come, Richard Ramirez continued to feed the mythology he had built, one last act of control over a city that had once lived in his shadow. When Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death on November 7, 1989, it marked the end of one of the most terrifying chapters in Los Angeles history. The courtroom had fallen silent as the judge delivered the sentence: execution by gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. For the families of his victims, there was a sense of relief. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. The city that had spent months living in fear could begin to breathe again. But for Richard Ramirez, the man behind the legend of the Night Stalker, the story was far from over. After his sentencing, Richard was transferred to San Quentin, a maximum security prison perched on the shores of the San Francisco Bay, notorious for housing California's most dangerous criminals. There, he became one of the hundreds of inmates awaiting execution on death row. The move didn't seem to faze him. To guards and fellow prisoners, Richard projected an air of indifference, carrying himself with the same eerie calm that had unsettled detectives and jurors during his trial. He never apologized, never showed remorse, and never admitted to wrongdoing. Instead, he doubled down on his carefully crafted persona, one part predator, one part prophet of darkness. Inside San Quentin, Richard Ramirez lived under some of the strictest confinement conditions in the country. Death row prisoners spent the majority of their days locked in small, single-inmate cells measuring roughly 6 by 10 feet. He had limited recreation time, no contact visits, and constant supervision. But even within these walls, Richard managed to maintain a sense of control over his narrative. Letters poured in from admirers, many from women fascinated by his notoriety, his image, and his rebellion against authority. Some saw him as dangerous, others as charismatic, and a surprising number were drawn to him romantically. Over time, Richard began corresponding regularly with several of these admirers. One, a freelance writer named Doreen Lyle, became a central figure in his prison life. Doreen, who had followed his trial obsessively, wrote him dozens of letters before finally visiting him in person. Despite knowing the gruesome details of his crimes, she insisted publicly that Richard was misunderstood and not the monster the media portrayed. Their relationship developed into something more than a correspondence. On October 3, 1996, the two were married inside San Quentin in a small ceremony attended by only a handful of witnesses. The marriage sparked outrage from the families of Ramirez's victims and bewildered much of the public. For many, it was impossible to understand how anyone could love a man responsible for such brutality. But to Doreen, Richard represented something deeper, a symbol of defiance, mystery, and dark charisma. The wedding cemented Richard as transformation from a feared predator into a cultural phenomenon, someone whose crimes, trial, and personality blurred the line between horror and fascination. Despite the marriage, Richard remained emotionally distant. Fellow inmates recalled that he rarely spoke about Doreen or his personal life. Instead, he spent much of his time reading about the occult, sketching pentagrams, and maintaining the image he had cultivated during his trial. He gave occasional interviews, during which he calmly discussed his crimes, Satanism, and death itself. In one interview, when asked if he regretted anything, Richard replied simply, "No, I don't think like you do. To me, death is just part of life. We all die. That's the only guarantee." While Ramirez's life in San Quentin seemed uneventful compared to his reign of terror, the world outside continued to obsess over his case. Documentaries, books, and talk shows dissected every detail of the investigation and trial. His pale, gaunt face, hollow eyes, and iconic mugshot became symbolic of a kind of evil that was at once terrifying and strangely captivating. The Night Stalker wasn't just a killer anymore. He had become part of American pop culture. But behind the myth, the reality of Richard's life on death row was one of isolation and slow decay. Despite his public defiance, his health began to deteriorate in the 2000s. Years of substance abuse, poor diet, and neglect caught up with him, and he developed several chronic conditions, including hepatitis C. He became increasingly frail, his once lean frame thinning further as he battled infection and illness. His marriage to Doreen eventually collapsed under the strain of his declining health and the restrictions of prison life. By the mid-2000s, they were no longer in contact, though she never publicly confirmed the end of their relationship. Meanwhile, legal delays kept Richard on death row for decades. California's appeals system for capital punishment is notoriously slow, and his defense team filed numerous motions attempting to overturn his conviction, citing procedural errors and ineffective counsel. None of these efforts succeeded. Ramirez remained in the same small cell at San Quentin, year after year, as the legal system debated his fate. In 2013, nearly 24 years after his death sentence, Richard Ramirez's story came to an unexpected end. On June 7, 2013, he died at the age of 53 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. He had been receiving treatment at Marin General Hospital near the prison, but his weakened immune system and long-standing health problems made recovery impossible. By the time he passed away, Richard Ramirez had spent more than half his life behind bars. News of his death spread quickly, reigniting discussions about his crimes, his trial, and his legacy. For the families of his victims, his passing brought a complicated mix of emotions. Some described it as closure, while others said his death could never undo the pain he caused. One relative of a victim said simply, "It doesn't bring her back, but at least now he can't hurt anyone else." Even in death, Richard Ramirez remained polarizing. To some, he was a symbol of pure evil, a predator who embodied randomness and chaos, terrorizing a city without mercy or logic. To others, he was an object of fascination, his persona elevated by decades of media coverage, his image frozen in the cultural consciousness as the face of a killer who seemed larger than life. Documentaries and series continued to revisit his story, ensuring that the fear he created in 1985 would never be forgotten. From a criminology perspective, the Night Stalker case transformed how law enforcement approaches investigations into serial killers. Ramirez's randomness, his lack of a clear victim profile, his varied methods, and his constant mobility challenged the assumptions detectives had long relied on. The case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation, forensic technology, and community involvement. It was the fingerprint recovered from the Mission Viejo car, combined with the distinctive obvious sneaker prints and ballistic evidence, that ultimately allowed detectives to identify and capture him. Without that level of coordination, Richard Ramirez might have eluded justice for much longer. The Night Stalker case also exposed the psychological toll serial crimes inflict on entire communities. For months, Los Angeles lived in a state of collective trauma. Families altered their routines, neighborhoods fortified their homes, and people distrusted one another. Even decades later, survivors and relatives of victims spoke of living with lasting anxiety, always double-checking locks, and fearing footsteps in the dark. Ramirez didn't just kill, he disrupted a sense of safety that took years to rebuild. But perhaps the most haunting part of Richard Ramirez's legacy is the glimpse it provides into the mind of a predator. Unlike many serial killers who follow rigid patterns or psychological compulsions, Richard embraced chaos. He killed men and women, young and old, rich and poor. He used guns, knives, hammers, and his bare hands. He sexually assaulted some victims and spared others without explanation. His unpredictability made him uniquely dangerous and amplified the terror he spread. In his mind, this randomness was power, a reflection of his belief that he operated outside morality, guided by a force greater than human law. His devotion to Satan, whether genuine faith or carefully curated performance, also became a defining part of his identity. Richard understood that fear wasn't just about physical danger, it was psychological. By invoking Satan, weaving pentagrams, and forcing survivors to swear to darkness, he weaponized belief itself. He wanted his victims, the police, and the city to see him as something beyond human, untouchable, inevitable, unstoppable. In some ways, he succeeded. Yet in the end, Richard Ramirez was mortal. The man who once prowled Los Angeles like a phantom spent nearly 3 decades confined to a 6 by 10-foot cell, his power reduced to shadows of the past. His death in 2013 closed one chapter, but the echoes of his crimes continue to reverberate through true crime literature, documentaries, and collective memory. For the city of Los Angeles, the summer of 1985 remains unforgettable, a time when the night itself became dangerous, when trust dissolved, and when one man's violence reshaped the way an entire community lived and breathed. The legacy of terror left by Richard Ramirez is more than a series of crimes. It is a reminder of how fragile the illusion of safety can be and how quickly fear can consume a city when chaos is unleashed. And without warning. Today, his story is studied not just by criminologists and investigators, but by psychologists, sociologists, and cultural historians seeking to understand why people like Richard Ramirez both horrify and fascinate us. He occupies a rare, disturbing space in the public consciousness, a killer whose randomness magnified his myth, whose defiance fueled his fame, and whose shadow still lingers decades after his death. In the end, Richard Ramirez didn't escape judgment. He didn't walk free. He didn't cheat death. For all his proclamations of power, for all his chants of Hail Satan, and declarations of invincibility, he died alone in a hospital bed, shackled and frail, far removed from the chaos he once commanded. But his story remains carried forward in whispers, headlines, and nightmares. The Night Stalker is gone, yet the fear he created still lives on, in the memories of those who survived, in the families who lost loved ones, and in a city that learned, for one long summer, just how deep into darkness a single man could drag them.